Εξοχότατε κύριε Πρέσβη, αξιότιμη κύριε Γενική Διευθυντήτρια Αρχαιοτήτων, αγάπητοι συναδέλφοι και φίλοι, κυρίες και κύριοι. Είναι μεγάλη μου χαρά και τιμή να σας καλωρίζω απόψε στο γιορτάσιμο του έργου του Professor Lord Renfrew στην Ελλάδα. Θα ήθελα να εκφράσω εκ μέρους της Οργανωτικής Επιτροπής Μαρίζα Μαρθάρη, Εύη Μαργαρίτη, Δημήτρης Αθανασούλης, Ζέτα Πολυχρονιάδη, Michael Boyd and myself, της ευχαρίστης μας στον Γενικό Γραμματεία της Αρχαιολογικής Εταιρείας κ. Κάουτσα και στο προσωπικό της εταιρείας για την φιλοξενία τους. Επίσης, ευχαριστώ θερμότητα του Υπουργείου Πολιτισμού, τη Βρετανική Σχολή Αθηνών και την Εφορία Αρχαιοτήτων Κυκλάδων. And it is a particular pleasure to be able to welcome to this event Colin's family, represented by his daughter Helena, son Magnus, and two of Magnus's sons, Archie and Jake. And you're all hugely welcome, particularly Archie and Jake. We have a very full program, and it is with great pleasure that we open the program with an address by the Minister of Culture, Dr. Lina Mandoni.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, εκλεκτοί και αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι και φίλοι, είναι μεγάλο προνόμιο να μιλάω σήμερα εκ μέρους του Ελληνικού Υπουργείου Πολιτισμού σε αυτή την εκδήλωση που τιμά τη ζωή και την κληρονομιά του καθηγητή Λόρδου Colin Renfrew, ενός οραματιστή επιστήμονα, ακούραστου υπερασπιστή της πολιτιστικής κληρονομιάς και αληθινού φίλου της Ελλάδας. Η συμβολή του Colin Renfrew στην αρχαιολογική επιστήμη υπήρξε επαναστατική. Βοήθησε να επαναπροσδιοριστεί η αρχαιολογία ως κλάδος θεμελιωμένος στη μεθοδολογία των θετικών επιστημών, στη θεωρητική σαφήνεια και στην ηθική ευθύνη. Από τη βαθμονόμηση του ραδιενεργού άνθρακα ως την ανάλυση της προέλευσης του οψιδιανού και την αρχαιογενετική, εισήγαγε αυστηρά και σχολαστικά εργαλεία για να δώσει απάντηση σε βαθιά ερωτήματα της ανθρώπινης ιστορίας. Το εμβληματικό του έργο, The Emergence of Civilisation, αμφισβήτησε παγιωμένες αντιλήψεις και προσέφερε ένα νέο πλαίσιο κατανόησης του αιγαιακού κόσμου, όχι ως παθητικού δέκτη εξωτερικών επιρροών, αλλά ως γνήσιου πολιτιστικού παραγωγού, χαρακτηριζόμενου από βαθύ εν γενή δυναμισμό. Το έργο του Renfrew δεν ήταν μόνο θεωρητικό. Ήταν βαθιά ριζωμένο στην έρευνα του πεδίου. Αυτό που δεν είναι πουθενά πιο ξεκάθαρο από τη διαβίου ενασχόλησή του με τις Κυκλάδες. Από την πρώιμη διδακτορική του έρευνα ως τις ανασκαφές στο Saliagos, στη Phylakopi και ιδιαίτερα στην Κέρο, ο Colin συνέβαλε ώστε η επιστημονική εστίαση στις προϊστορικές Κυκλάδες να γίνει οξύτερη και εναργέστερη. Το έργο του αποκάλυψε μια κοινωνία πλούσια σε τελετουργίες, κατασκευαστικές τεχνικές και διασυνδέσεις, τοποθετώντας τα νησιά στην πρωτοπορία των εξελίξεων της αιγαιακής προϊστορίας. Η ανακαλύψη στην Κέρο, συμπεριλαμβανομένων των ενιγματικών σπασμένων ειδωλίων και των ζωνών τελετουργικής απόθεσης, αναδιαμόρφωσαν την κατανόησή μας για τον πρωτοκυκλαδικό πολιτισμό και συνεχίζουν να εμπνέουν νέες γενιές ερευνητών. Το έργο του στο πεδίο ήταν σχολαστικό, οι ερμηνείες του τολμηρές και οι δημοσιεύσεις του θεμελιώδεις. Έδωσε στις Κυκλάδες μια δυνατή και διακριτή φωνή που μιλούσε για κοινωνική πολυπλοκότητα, συνεχή εξέλιξη και καινοτομία. Ανέδειξε τον ρόλο των νησιών όχι πλέον ως περιφερειακό, αλλά ως κεντρικό για τον αιγαιακό πολιτισμό. Αλλά ο Colin Renfrew δεν ήταν μόνο επιστήμονας και ερευνητής. Ήταν επίσης αδιάλακτος υπερασπιστής της αρχαιολογικής ηθικής. Υπήρξε από τους πρώτους που μίλησαν δυναμικά εναντίον της παράνομης διακίνησης αρχαιοτήτων, χαρακτηρίζοντάς την ως την μεγαλύτερη απειλή για την αρχαιολογική κληρονομιά του κόσμου. Μέσω του ερευνητικού κέντρου για τις παράνομες αρχαιότητες στο Cambridge, συνέβαλε στην αποκάλυψη της ζημιάς που προκαλεί τόσο η λαιλασία όσο και η συλλογή χωρίς έλεγχο της προέλευσης. Υπερασπίστηκε τον έλεγχο της προέλευσης, του συνολικού πλαισίου της προέλευσης και της διαφάνειας, αρχές που σήμερα είναι ενσωματωμένες στη διεθνή πολιτική και στην πρακτική των μουσείων. Για την Ελλάδα, η φωνή του Renfrew υπήρξε ισχυρός σύμμαχος στις συνεχιζόμενες προσπάθειες της χώρας να προστατεύσει την πολιτιστική της κληρονομιά. Η υποστήριξή του ενίσχυσε την αποφασιστικότητά μας και έδωσε διεθνές βάρος στις εκστρατείες μας για την επιστροφή και προστασία των αρχαιοτήτων. Υποστήριζε ότι η κληρονομιά δεν αφορά μόνο αντικείμενα, αλλά κυρίως νοήματα, μνήμες και ταυτότητες. Εξίσου διαρκής είναι και η κληρονομιά του ως δάσκαλου και μέντορα. Για δεκαετίες, στο Σέφιλντ, στο Southampton και στο Cambridge, ο Colin διαμόρφωσε γενιές αρχαιολόγων, πολλοί από τους οποίους εργάζονται και σήμερα και στην Ελλάδα. Δημιούργησε περιβάλλοντα όπου οι τολμηρές ιδέες μπορούσαν να ανθίσουν, όπου η επιστήμη συναντούσε τον ανθρωπισμό και όπου οι νέοι επιστήμονες ενθαρρύνονταν να σκέφτονται κριτικά και ηθικά. Οι μαθητές του θυμούνται όχι μόνο την πνευματική του αυστηρότητα, αλλά και τη γενεοδορία του, την ενθάρρυνσή του και την ικανότητά του να εμπνέει. Ως Master του Jesus College και ιδρυτικός διευθυντής του McDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, δημιούργησε θεσμούς που συνεχίζουν να υποστηρίζουν τη διεπιστημονική έρευνα και τη διεθνή συνεργασία. Το όραμά του εκτεινόταν πέρα από την αίθουσα της διδασκαλίας και το ανασκαφικό σκάμα. Διαμόρφωσε την ίδια την υποδομή της σύγχρονης αρχαιολογικής έρευνας. Για όλους αυτούς τους λόγους, το Υπουργείο Πολιτισμού της Ελληνικής Δημοκρατίας, αλλά και ο ελληνικός λαός, οφείλουν στον Colin Renfrew βαθιά ευγνωμοσύνη. Δεν ήταν απλώς ένας ξένος επιστήμονας που εργάστηκε στην Ελλάδα. Ήταν ένας στενός συνεργάτης και ένας μοναδικός φίλος. Οι δεσμοί του με τη Βρετανική Σχολή Αθηνών, την Αρχαιολογική Εταιρεία και την Εφορία Αρχαιοτήτων Κυκλάδων βοήθησαν να χτιστούν γέφυρες που συνεχίζουν να στηρίζουν την έρευνα, τη συντήρηση και τη δημόσια ευαισθητοποίηση και κινητοποίηση. Το έργο του εμπλούτησε την κατανόησή μας για το παρελθόν. Το παράδειγμά του συνεχίζει να μας καθοδηγεί στη διαχείριση του παρελθόντος. Μας έδειξε ότι η αρχαιολογία δεν αφορά μόνο στην ανακάλυψη, αλλά πρωτίστως στην ευθύνη. Αφορά στην προστασία των εύθραυστων νημάτων που μας συνδέουν με την ιστορία μας. Επιτρέψτε μου να κλείσω με δύο σκέψεις που πιστεύω ότι θα στήριζε ο Colin Renfrew. Πρώτον, ότι το παρελθόν δεν είναι μία συλλογή τροπαίων, αλλά ένα πεδίο γνώσης όπου το πλαίσιο αρχών έχει ιδιαίτερη σημασία και που η επιστήμη και η ηθική πρέπει να πορεύονται χέρι-χέρι. Δεύτερον, ότι το καθήκον μας δεν είναι μόνο να ανασκάπτουμε και να ερμηνεύουμε, αλλά να προστατεύουμε και να μεταδίδουμε τη γνώση μέσω της διδασκαλίας, ώστε οι επόμενες γενιές να κληρονομούν όχι υλικά θραύσματα, αλλά πλήρη νοήματα. Εκ μέρους του Υπουργείου Πολιτισμού της Ελληνικής Δημοκρατίας και εκ μέρους της Ελλάδας, ευχαριστώ τον Colin Renfrew από τα βάθη της καρδιάς μου. Ήθε η κληρονομιά του να συνεχίζει να φωτίζει τις Κυκλάδες και να μας καθοδηγεί όλους. Σας ευχαριστώ.
I would now like to invite His Excellency Matthew Lodge, the British Ambassador to the Hellenic Republic.
Εκλεκτοί προσεκλημένοι, κυρίες και κύριοι, φίλες και φίλοι, ladies and gentlemen, I will speak only briefly, but following those beautiful words from Dr. Mendoni, I'd just like to say how it is a great honour and privilege for me to be able to be here tonight amongst such distinguished company to remember Colin Renfrew. I did not have the pleasure of meeting Colin myself, even though this is my second time serving in Athens. But when I read that he was a man described as a titan of archaeology, a man who tackled questions key to understanding who we are, what makes us human, how migration changes culture, why civilizations appear, and what art means. And furthermore, as we've heard so beautifully from the minister, that he was a great friend of Greece and somebody whose name was linked to the Cyclades, and particularly Keros and elsewhere, then I think it's very appropriate that the British ambassador should be here with you all this evening. So thank you for allowing me to do so. I'd also like to take the opportunity to pick up on the reference to the British School at Athens and to Rebecca and her team. As an ambassador, I've had the privilege to be here at this time for the last 4 years. The essence of what our work is about is to strengthen the ties and connections between the United Kingdom and the Hellenic Republic. And I use the word advisedly when I say it is with great humility that I look at the figure of somebody like Lord Renfrew. And I think, what can we possibly do in the footsteps of a man who has made such a contribution over such a long period of time? But I'm delighted that we have today still the British School here in Athens, with the director, with the students, with all the alumni, and that an institution that for almost 140 years now, the UK's oldest research institution abroad, I believe, has been doing and continues to do outstanding and often pioneering work in the field of Hellenic studies, not just archaeology. It makes me not only proud, but also confident for the future. And I'm delighted to know that the British School at Athens played such a big part in so much of what Colin did over the years. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I know we're in for a fascinating evening to learn more about this wonderful man. I'm delighted that the family are here this evening. And thank you. And I'm glad to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'd like to welcome Dr. Olympia Ficatu, Director General of Antiquities and Cultural Heritage, to the floor. Thank you.
Καλησπέρα σας. Εξοχότατε, κύριε Πρέσβη, αξιότιμοι κυρίες και κύριοι διευθυντές των σχολών, κύριοι καθηγητές, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι, φίλες και φίλοι. Σήμερα δεν τιμούμε απλώς ένα μεγάλο αρχαιολόγο. Τιμούμε έναν άνθρωπο του οποίου το όνομα έχει πλέον συνδεθεί άρρηκτα με την ελληνική αρχαιολογία. Τον Colin Renfrew. Για όσους υπηρετούμε την προστασία και την ανάδειξη της πολιτιστικής κληρονομιάς, ο Colin δεν είναι μόνο ένα διεθνές σημείο αναφοράς. Είναι ένας συνοδοιπόρος δεκαετιών. Από την πρώτη του επαφή με την Ελλάδα στις αρχές της δεκαετίας του 60, όταν ήρθε ως νέος ερευνητής και επέλεξε την κυκλαδική προϊστορία για τη διδακτορική του διατρεβή μέχρι τις τελευταίες του επισκέψεις, η σχέση του με τη χώρα μας υπήρξε σταθερή, δημιουργική και βαθιά ανθρώπινη. Οι Κυκλάδες αλλά και το Αιγαίο συνολικά δεν ήταν για εκείνον απλώς πεδίο έρευνας. Ήταν ο τόπος στον οποίο επέστρεφε διαρκώς επιστημονικά και συναισθηματικά. Κυρίες και κύριοι, ως Γενική Διεύθυνση Αρχαιοτήτων και Πολιτιστικής Κληρονομιάς, βλέπουμε τον Colin Renfrew μέσα από ένα διπλό πρίσμα, ως κορυφαίο επιστήμονα και ως θεσμικό σύμμαχο του ελληνικού κράτους. Από πολύ νωρίς επέλεξε να εργαστεί στην Ελλάδα με πλήρη σεβασμό προς το θεσμικό μας πλαίσιο. Οι ανασκαφές του στην νησίδα Σάλιαγκο Αντιπάρου, στους Σιταγρούς στη Μακεδονία, μην ξεχνάμε και τη δραστηριότητά του στη Βόρεια Ελλάδα, στη Πhylakopi της Μήλου, στη Markiani της Αμοργού και βεβαίως στην Κέρο και το Δασκαλιό. Οι έρευνες, οι δύο τελευταίες τις οποίες επικεντρώθηκε τις δεκαετίες 2000 και 2010, υλοποιήθηκαν πάντα σε στενή συνεργασία με το Υπουργείο Πολιτισμού, την Αρχαιολογική Υπηρεσία και τις αρμόδιες εφορίες αρχαιοτήτων. Δεν ήταν ο ξένος επιστήμονας που έρχεται, σκάβει και φεύγει. Αντιλαμβανόταν ότι η έρευνα σε αυτόν τον τόπο περνά μέσα από τη συνεργασία με τις ελληνικές αρχές, τη διαφύλαξη του αρχαιολογικού τοπίου, το σεβασμό στην τοπική κοινωνία. Γι' αυτό και οι βαρύνουσες δημοσιεύσεις του για τις θέσεις αυτές, υποδειγματικές σε πληρότητα και μεθοδολογία, αποτελούν μέχρι σήμερα σημείο αναφοράς όχι μόνο για την ιστορία των Κυκλάδων, αλλά και για τον τρόπο με τον οποίο οφείλουμε να οργανώνουμε, να τεκμηριώνουμε και να μοιραζόμαστε την αρχαιολογική γνώση. Θα ήταν όμως πολύ περιοριστικό να δούμε τον Colin Renfrew μόνο ως άνθρωπο του πεδίου. Ήταν ένας από τους ελάχιστους αρχαιολόγους της γενιάς του που κατάφεραν να συνδέσουν την ανασκαφική εμπειρία με ένα συνεκτικό θεωρητικό όραμα. Με το εμβληματικό του έργο, η ανάδυση του πολιτισμού έθεσε τις Κυκλάδες στο κέντρο της διεθνούς συζήτησης για την πρώιμη κοινωνική οργάνωση και την ανάδυση σύνθετων κοινωνιών. Για πρώτη φορά, ο προϊστορικός αιγαιακός κόσμος και ιδιαίτερα ο πρωτοκυκλαδικός πολιτισμός δεν παρουσιάζονταν ως περιφερειακό παρακολούθημα άλλων μεγάλων κέντρων, αλλά ως αυτόνομο δυναμικό σύστημα με δικές του εσωτερικές εξελίξεις. Σε συνδυασμό με τα άλλα έργα του, αμφισβήτησε τις εύκολες εξηγήσεις της διάχυσης και τόνισε τη σημασία των τοπικών εξελίξεων, της χρονολόγησης με επιστημονικές μεθόδους και της διεπιστημονικής προσέγγισης. Όλα αυτά δεν ήταν αφηρημένη θεωρία. Επηρέασαν βαθιά τον τρόπο με τον οποίο διδάσκουμε και σκεφτόμαστε την ελληνική προϊστορία στα δικά μας πανεπιστήμια και στις εφορίες μας. Κορυφαία του θέση στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Cambridge δεν τον απομάκρυνε από την Ελλάδα. Αντίθετα, αξιοποίησε αυτά τα θεσμικά βάθρα για να ενισχύσει τη συνεργασία με το ελληνικό κράτος, να φιλοξενήσει Έλληνες ερευνητές, να στηρίξει επιστημονικά προγράμματα που είχαν ως σημείο αναφορά στο Αιγαίο. Κυρίες και κύριοι, για εμάς, ίσως η πιο πολύτιμη πλευρά της δράσης του δεν ήταν μόνο η αρχαιολογική του συμβολή, αλλά η ηθική του στάση απέναντι στην πολιτιστική μας κληρονομιά. Ο Colin Renfrew είδε από πολύ νωρίς, μέσα από τις Κυκλάδες, το μέγεθος της καταστροφής που προκαλεί η αρχαιοκαπηλεία. Δεν έμεινε σε γενικόλογες διαπιστώσεις. Στο πλαίσιο του McDonald Institute ίδρυσε το Κέντρο Έρευνας για την Παράνομη Διακίνηση, την πρώτη δομημένη προσπάθεια να μελετηθεί συστηματικά η διεθνής παράνομη διακίνηση αρχαιοτήτων και η επίδρασή της στο αρχαιολογικό αρχείο. Μέσα από αυτό το κέντρο, μέσα από δημόσιες παρεμβάσεις και κείμενα με ιδιαίτερη απήχηση, διατύπωσε με σαφήνεια αυτό που σήμερα θεωρούμε αυτονόητο, ότι τα μουσεία και οι συλλέκτες δεν μπορούν να κλείνουν τα μάτια στην προέλευση ενός αντικειμένου, ότι τα ορφανά και κλαδικά ειδόλια δεν είναι απλώς αισθητικά αντικείμενα, αλλά τεκμήρια βίας απέναντι στον τόπο από τον οποίο αποσπάστηκαν. Για την Ελλάδα, που έχει πληρώσει βαρύ τίμημα από τη λαιλασία των μνημείων της, αυτή η φωνή είχε ιδιαίτερη σημασία. Δεν ήταν μόνο η φωνή ενός μεγάλου επιστήμονα, αλλά ενός ανθρώπου που είχε δεθεί με τα νησιά, με τα τοπία, με τους ανθρώπους που ζουν σε αυτά. Το παράδειγμα της Κέρου και του δασκαλιού είναι ίσως το πιο χαρακτηριστικό. Ένας χώρος που υπήρξε επί δεκαετίες στόχος εκτεταμένης αρχαιοκαπηλείας, μετατράπηκε μέσα από την κοινή προσπάθεια του Υπουργείου Πολιτισμού, της Εφορίας Αρχαιοτήτων και Κλάδων, της Βρετανικής Σχολής Αθηνών και της ομάδας του Colin Renfrew σε πρότυπο επιστημονικής έρευνας και διεθνούς συνεργασίας. Εκεί δεν μελετήθηκαν μόνο στρώματα και ευρήματα. Αποκαταστάθηκε όσο ήταν δυνατόν η συνέχεια ανάμεσα σε ένα πληγωμένο τοπίο και την ιστορία του. Σε αυτό το πλαίσιο, η σημερινή εκδήλωση στη μνήμη του και στο έργο ζωής της Κυκλάδες και πέρα από αυτές, είναι για τη Γενική Διεύθυνση Αρχαιοτήτων κάτι περισσότερο από μία τιμητική αναφορά. Είναι μία στιγμή απολογισμού και δέσμευσης. Απολογισμού γιατί αναλογιζόμαστε πόσο έχει επηρεάσει το έργο μας. Στον τρόπο που βλέπουμε τις προϊστορικές κοινωνίες του Αιγαίου, στον τρόπο που οργανώνουμε τη συνεργασία μας με διεθνή ιδρύματα, στον τρόπο που υπερασπιζόμαστε θεσμικά την πολιτιστική κληρονομιά. Και δέσμευσης γιατί η καλύτερη τιμή στη μνήμη του είναι να συνεχίσουμε σε αυτή τη γραμμή, με διαφάνεια, με αυστηρή τήρηση της νομοθεσίας, με ενίσχυση της επιστημονικής έρευνας, με μηδενική ανοχή στην παράνομη διακίνηση αρχαιοτήτων, με έμπρακτη στήριξη στις εφορίες που βρίσκονται στην πρώτη γραμμή. Ο Colin Renfrew ανήκει βεβαίως στην ιστορία της παγκόσμιας αρχαιολογίας. Ανήκει όμως και στην ιστορία της ελληνικής αρχαιολογικής υπηρεσίας. Οι γενιές των Ελλήνων αρχαιολόγων που συνεργάστηκαν μαζί του, που μελέτησαν τα βιβλία του, που πέρασαν από τα σεμινάρια και τα εργαστήριά του, γνωρίζουν ότι η παρακαταθήκη του δεν είναι μόνο επιστημονική. Είναι και βαθιά ανθρώπινη. Συνέπεια, σεβασμός προς τους θεσμούς, διάθεση να ακούσει, να συζητήσει, να αμφισβητήσει κατεστημένες βεβαιότητες, χωρίς να ακυρώνει τη δουλειά των άλλων. Σήμερα, ενώπιον των συνεργαζόμενων φορέων και της επιστημονικής κοινότητας, θα ήθελα να εκφράσω εκ μέρους της Γενικής Διεύθυνσης Αρχαιοτήτων και Πολιτιστικής Κληρονομιάς τη βαθιά μας ευγνωμοσύνη, τη βαθιά ευγνωμοσύνη της αρχαιολογικής κοινότητας για αυτό το σύνολο της προσφοράς του. Θα ήθελα επίσης να ευχαριστήσω θερμά τη Βρετανική Σχολή Αθηνών, την Εναθήνες Αρχαιολογική Εταιρεία, την Εφορία Αρχαιοτήτων και Κλάδων, την Οργανωτική Επιτροπή και βεβαίως όλους τους συναδέλφους που συνέβαλαν στη διοργάνωση της σημερινής ημερίδας, όπως και την οικογένεια του Colin Renfrew, που μοιράστηκε μαζί μας έναν άνθρωπο ο οποίος αφιέρωσε τόσο μεγάλο μέρος της ζωής του στην Ελλάδα. Η μνήμη του θα συνεχίσει να είναι παρούσα κάθε φορά που κοιτάζουμε ένα πρωτοκυκλαδικό ειδόλιο, όχι ως αντικείμενο τέχνης, αλλά ως φωνή μιας κοινωνίας που προσπαθούμε ακόμα να κατανοήσουμε. Κάθε φορά που συζητάμε για τις ηθικές διαστάσεις της αρχαιολογίας, κάθε φορά που ένας νέος ερευνητής ανοίγει τις σελίδες της ανάδυσης του πολιτισμού και ανακαλύπτει μέσα από τα δεδομένα των κυκλάδων ένα νέο τρόπο να σκέφτεται το παρελθόν. Ας επιτρέψουμε λοιπόν στον Colin Renfrew να παραμείνει αυτό που υπήρξε πάντα για την Ελλάδα. Ένας ακούραστος ερευνητής του Αιγαίου, ένας επίμονος υπερασπιστής της πολιτιστικής κληρονομιάς και ένας αληθινός φίλος αυτού του τόπου. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ και εύχομαι κάθε επιτυχία στις εργασίες του συνεδρίου. Ευχαριστώ.
Thank you very much. I'd like to send greetings from Dr. Kalsas, who unfortunately and rather unexpectedly is out of Athens. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Dimitris Athanasoulis to the floor. He is the director of the Ephorate of Antiquities of the Cyclades.
Εξοχότατε κύριε Πρέσβη, αξιότιμη Γενική Διευθύντρια Αρχαιοτήτων και Πολιτιστικής Κληρονομιάς, αγαπητοί και αγαπητές συνάδελφοι, αξιότιμες κυρίες και κύριοι, η Εφορία Αρχαιοτήτων Κυκλάδων τιμά σήμερα τη μνήμη του μεγάλου αρχαιολόγου Colin Renfrew, ο οποίος όχι μόνο υπήρξε κορυφαίος μελετητής της κυκλαδικής αρχαιολογίας, αλλά ταυτόχρονα στενός συνεργάτης σε φόρων και επιμελητών αρχαιοτήτων από το 1960 έως τη σήμερα. Γνώρισα τον Colin Renfrew το 2015. Είχε περάσει ήδη μισός αιώνας από τότε που ο καθηγητής είχε αρχίσει να ερευνά τον κυκλαδικό πολιτισμό και 30 χρόνια από τότε που έμαθα τον Renfrew στο Πανεπιστήμιο μέσα από τα βιβλία του ως έναν από τους ανανεωτές της αρχαιολογικής επιστήμης. Είχα τη μοναδική τιμή να συνεργαστώ με αυτή την θρυλική μορφή της παγκόσμιας αρχαιολογίας στο πρόγραμμα έρευνας στην Keros, στα κάτω που φωνήσει, και στην νοτιοανατολική Άξο από το 2015 έως και το 2018. Θα είχα πολλά να διηγηθώ από αυτή την εμπειρία. Όμως, οι λαμπροί ομιλητές της απόψινής εκδήλωσης θα έχουν να αφηγηθούν πολύ περισσότερα, καθώς η σχέση τους με τον καθηγητή μετρά δεκαετίες. Σε κάθε περίπτωση, δεν μπορώ να μη σημειώσω τον νεανικό ενθουσιασμό του στην παρακολούθηση των απαιτητικών ερευνών πεδίου ή τον μαεστρικό συντονισμό της πολυπληθούς και πολυεθνικής ερευνητικής ομάδας. Το εντυπωσιακότερο είναι ότι ο Colin Renfrew είχε μεριμνήσει ώστε το ερευνητικό πρόγραμμα να ενσωματώνει την τελευταία λέξη της τεχνολογίας και δι της ψηφιακής, ανοίγοντας διαρκώς νέους δρόμους στην ασκαφική και γενικότερα στην αρχαιολογική μεθοδολογία. Έχοντας ήδη ο ίδιος από νωρίς αναγνωρίσει τη σημασία των φυσικών επιστημών στην τεκμηρίωση και κυρίως στην επαλήθευση των αρχαιολογικών δεδομένων με μετρήσιμες και αντικειμενικά ελέγξιμες μεθόδους, εξακολούθησε να ανανεώνει ως την τελευταία του έρευνα όλα τα διαθέσιμα τεχνολογικά και επιστημονικά εργαλεία. Το πρόγραμμα έρευνα Κέρου του δασκαλιού συνέβαλε καθοριστικά στην αποκρυπτογράφηση της σημασίας αυτού του μικρού νησιού, αλλά και ευρύτερα της Νάξου και των μικρών κυκλάδων για την εξέλιξη του κυκλαδικού πολιτισμού. Ταυτόχρονα, η κοινή μας έρευνα κατέγραψε όχι μόνο την πρώιμη εποχή του χαλκού, αλλά και όλα τα υλικά κατάλοιπα της κυκλαδικής διαχρονίας, καθώς ο καθηγητής αναγνώριζε την σημασία της μακράς διάρκειας για την κατανόηση ενός τόπου. Η έρευνα τεκμηρίωσε έτσι τις συνέχειες και τις ασυνέχειες, τις μεταμορφώσεις και τις μεταλλάξεις στην οργάνωση και χρήση του μικρονησιωτικού χώρου ανά τους αιώνας, καθώς το κυκλαδικό αρχιπέλαγος από πρωτοκυκλαδικό κέντρο ενσωματωνόταν πλέον στις μεγάλες πολιτισμικές και πολιτικές οντότητες της Μεσογειακής Λεκάνης. Η θέση του σπουδαίου πρωτοκυκλαδικού οικισμού του δασκαλιού ερημώνει και ξαναχρησιμοποιείται μετά από 3.000 χρόνια, όταν ανεγείρεται εκεί, ανάμεσα στα προϊστορικά κτίρια και με τα προϊστορικά δομικά υλικά, ένα μικρό βυζαντινό παρεκκλήσι τον 7ο αιώνα, για να ξαναπεράσει γρήγορα στη λύθη, μέχρι να επιστρέψουν εκεί οι αρχαιολόγοι στη δεκαετία του 1960. Η ερμηνεία των αποθέσεων της Κέρου ως λατρευτικού κέντρου ταιριάζει απόλυτα με ένα μοτίβο που επαναλαμβάνεται συστηματικά στο αρχιπέλαγος. Τα απομακρυσμένα κυκλαδονήσια, όπως το δεσποτικό ή η δήλωση, να χρησιμοποιούνται ως θρησκευτικά προσκυνήματα από τις νησιωτικές κοινότητες και όχι μόνο από αυτές. Μήπως και η μεγάλη βυζαντινή εκκλησία της Κέρου, που είχε εντοπιστεί από την κοινή μας έρευνα με τον καθηγητή, εντάσσεται άραγε σε αυτό το διαχρονικό μοτίβο? Η έρευνα του 2026 ίσως μας δώσει απαντήσεις. Ο Colin Renfrew αφιέρωσε τη ζωή του στην μελέτη του κυκλαδικού πολιτισμού, ο οποίος υπέστη βιβλικών διαστάσεων καταστροφή από την αρχαιοκοπηλική δράση. Ασφαλώς αυτή η εφιαλτική διάσταση δεν μπορούσε να αφήσει ασυγκίνητο τον καθηγητή, ο οποίος αξιοποίησε το διεθνές κύρος του για να αναδείξει αυτή τη μάστιγα, η οποία αφάνισε ανεπιστρεπτή μοναδικά αρχαιολογικά τεκμήρια και κατέστησε ακόμα δυσχερέστερη τη μελέτη και κατανόηση του αιγαιακού πολιτισμού της πρώιμης εποχής του Χαλκού. Ο καθηγητής γνώριζε καλά ότι η μελέτη του παρελθόντος αποκτά νόημα και υπόσταση όταν αυτή γίνεται οργανικό κομμάτι του παρόντος. Έτσι φρόντισε η γνώση που παράγει η έρευνα να μην μένει εγκλωβισμένη στο αρχαιολογικό ακροατήριο. Αντίθετα, να φτάνει στο ευρύ κοινό και δει των προκειμένων στους Κυκλαδίτες. Καρπός αυτής της άμεσης και αδιαμεσολάβητης σχέσης με το ευρύ κοινό ήταν και η έκθεση που συνδιοργανώσαμε με τον τίτλο «Δες απέναντι». Τα ευρήματα από τις ανασκαφές της Κέρου, πριν ακόμα δημοσιευτούν, εκτέθηκαν στο νέο Μουσείο του Φωνησίου, που εγκαινιάστηκε με αυτή ακριβώς την έκθεση, για να τα γνωρίσουν πρώτοι οι Κυκλαδίτες. Η απρόσιπη για το ευρύ κοινό Κέρος αποκάλυπτε τα μυστικά της με ξεναγό τον μεγάλο αρχαιολόγο. Η σπουδαία παρακαταθήκη που άφησε πίσω του με την έρευνα της Κέρου ο καθηγητής, η Εφορία Αρχαιοτήτων Κυκλάδων και η Βρετανική Σχολή Αθηνών αποφασίσαν από κοινού να την αξιοποιήσουν, συνεχίζοντας από εφέτος το Keros Project. Ο Μάικλ, η Εύη, ο Ομιλών, όλοι όσοι συμμετέχουμε σε αυτό, αισθανόμαστε στους ώμους μας το βάρος της κληρονομιάς του καθηγητή. Από την άλλη, πορευόμαστε με ασφάλεια στην τροχιά που ο ίδιος έχει χαράξει. Και από την ώρα που πατάμε το πόδι μας στο σπουδαίο Ξερονήσι, αισθανόμαστε να μας περιβάλλει νοερά η πατρική φιγούρα του μεγάλου αρχαιολόγου, όσο εμείς πασχίζουμε να φανούμε εντάξει της παρακαταθήκης του. Σας ευχαριστώ.
Thank you very much. It's my turn to say some words about Colin, but actually I feel like so much wonderful stuff has been said already that what I have to say is in lots of respects been already mentioned, but I think it is worth emphasizing the important legacy that Colin has given in not just the physical archives or anything like that, but the attitude, the innovation, the way he mentored people, his absolute determination to be fundamentally generous with his scholarship as well. He was involved in the BSA throughout his career, as we have heard. He was vice president of the BSA and former chairman of council. As chairman of the BSA Council from 2004 to 2009, he oversaw a period of financial challenge and institutional reorganization that essentially shaped the BSA as we know it today. During a difficult time of transition, the BSA was greatly strengthened by having such a distinguished and authoritative figure as its chairman, and benefited enormously from Colin's personal charm and diplomatic skills. However, these were his official roles, And of course, he meant so much more to the BSA and its wider family, thanks, as I said, to his generosity of knowledge, sharing, mentorship, innovative spirit, and unwavering love of Greece and its people and archaeology, and his outstanding contributions to scholarship through his work at sites like Phylakopi on Melos and Keros, as we've already heard. Colin's work and dedication helped shine a light on the value of the BSA, while also helping to strengthen important and enduring relationships between the BSA and archaeological communities in Greece and across the world. And as Michael has written, the legacy he has left for the school is both an inspiration and a challenge to which younger scholars must rise to as they take forward the work that he began. Thank you very much. So we'd like to begin the main part of the program now with the first speech by Professor Christos Doumas. His paper is called Colin Renfrew's Long Involvement to Greece and His Early Work in the 1960s.
Dear Colin's, colleagues and friends of Colin Renfrew and of us all. In the early spring of 1963, as Epimelitis, curator of the Ephorate of Antiquities for the Cyclades, then based in Mykonos, I was working in the Archaeological Museum of Naxos when I received a handwritten letter in German signed by somebody named Colin Renfrew. His request was to meet me because he was interested in the prehistoric culture of these islands. My first impression was of perplexity. At a time after the Second World War, when the English language had been established as the lingua franca around the world, why has an Englishman addressing a foreign in German? However, when we met in that summer of 1963 in Naxos, I understood right away why he did not write his letter in English. Colin was the epitome of integrity, fair-mindedness, unpretentiousness, unselfishness, and respect of people. Therefore, as he was not proficient in Greek at the time, he chose a neutral language out of politeness and lack of presumption. This explains why we became close friends and why our friendship grew day by day and over the years became firmer and firmer. My second impression was of curiosity. How come that scholarly interest in the early Cycladic culture, dormant for nearly half a century since the seminal pioneering research of Christos Tsountas, was being rekindled in the early 60s, and that the culprits were two young archaeologists, one British, Colin Renfrew, next. Is it? Yes. The difference between the two of us was the motive. Colin's interest was academic, whilst mine was practical and derived from my duty as a civil servant. However, looking back now, I realize that both of us were favored by fortune because the timing was right. The islands were just beginning to attract tourism, and the islanders were not yet interested in the thickness of their tourists' wallet. On the contrary, they were eager to meet visitors like us and willing to spend time talking to them. Whether farmers, shepherds, fishermen, or townspeople, they were precious sources of information concerning life in the Cycladic islands, where daily activities, dietary habits, and so many other issues seem to differ little from those of the prehistoric time. What was the state of the Cyclades, and more specifically, Cycladic archaeology, when Colin Renfrew first visited them, fresh from Cambridge and all set to embark on research for his PhD? Let me take a little of your time to put Colin in context. The first systematic excavations of early Cycladic settlements and cemeteries had been conducted in the late 19th century by the towering Greek scholar and indeed founder of the archaeology as a discipline in Greece, Christos Tsountas, who in two long articles of his in the archaeological ephemeris of the Archaeological Society at Athens, 1898 and 1899, was the first to distinguish the cultural difference between the Cyclades and the Greek mainland, and coined the term Cycladic culture. For half a century, these articles were the basic bibliography for this island culture, complemented by sundry studies by the physical anthropologists from Syros, Klon Stephanos, and a handful of others. In the 1950s, the great wounds inflicted on Greece, initially by the Second World War and subsequently by the Civil War, left little leeway for involvement with the cultural heritage. Nonetheless, early Cycladic marble figurines, which as chance finds had been acquired by and exhibited in museums abroad, were admired for their simplicity and had inspired major European artists such as Brancusi, Modigliani, and Picasso. So, in the 1950s, they were advertised by foreign dealers in Greek antiquities as ancient moderns. Consequence of this publicity was the continuous rise in demand for these pieces, even by individuals who had no idea about ancient art and history, but whose sole motivation was profit. As archaeological finds, both marble vessels and figurines as well as objects of little economic value today, such as poorly fired clay vases, necklaces of seashells or stone beads, and so on, were grave goods that accompanied the dead in their last resting place. However, marble figurines and vessels were not the norm, but where they existed were limited to a small number of graves in each cemetery, and may well have been symbols of social differentiation. And since neither the archaeologist nor the clandestine digger of early Cycladic cemeteries was able to foresee the content of each grave before excavating it, the demand for figurines in the international market resulted in such widespread looting in the islands during the decades 1950 and 1960, that neither the understaffed Director of Antiquities of the Ministry of National Education and Religions, nor the law enforcement authorities were able to cope with it. Circumstances began to improve in the early 60s with the founding of the ministry to the Prime Minister, under the umbrella of which the now upgraded General Directorate of Antiquities and Restoration passed, with Minister the later President of the Hellenic Republic, Konstantinos Tsatsos, and Director General of Antiquities, the hitherto Ephorate of Antiquities, Ioannis Papadimitriou, steps were taken that set their seal on a veritable Renaissance period for archaeology in Greece. Within 11 months, 2 public examinations were held to appoint curators, Epimelites, of antiquities, which almost doubled the existing scientific personnel of the Archaeological Service. Having completed my compulsory military service by the end of 1950s, I sat the second competitive examination successfully, and after a 6-month seminar in which we learned the rudiments of the then applicable archaeological legislation, the organization of the service, and the maintenance of the cultural heritage, in the spring of 1961, I was placed in the Ephorate of prehistoric and classical antiquities of the Cyclades, Caria and Samos, with effort, the titan of knowledge, integrity, and modesty, the late Nikolaos Zafiropoulos. The doubling of the scientific personnel of the Ephorate with my arrival enabled the effort to manage more effectively the Polynesia entrusted to his responsibility. My first assignment was to tour the islands, to get to know the monuments, and to inventory their needs. Since there were few roads on the islands in those days, this meant that I toured the countryside on foot or at best donkey or mule, along rural pathways intended more for sheep and goats than humans. I found also that the considerable distances meant spending the night often in the middle of nowhere, under the stars. Fortunately, I had purposed beforehand in Monastiraki Esulubamia, which was the Greek pronunciation of sleeping bag, a novelty brought back by soldiers returning from the Korean War. As I've said already, in the early 60s, antiquities looting, archaeokapillia, was rife in the Cyclades. The extensive plains of the largest island, Naxos, had favored the establishment of several prehistoric settlements with an economy based on agriculture and animal husbandry, each of which had its own cemetery. Truly tragic, however, was my realization that both the looters who carried out the illicit digging and the local traffickers of their ill-gotten gains enjoyed the protection of senior political figures of the period. Indeed, it was not uncommon for them to intervene and obstruct the actions of the local police. The marble figurines were known in the vernacular as kuklakia, little dolls. However, since the peasants who procured them were unable to estimate their commercial value, they had defined a selling price by length, 1,000 drachmas a centimeter. For the safe dispatching of them to Athens, different means had been devised, such as packing them inside large baskets full of potatoes, or an export product of Naxos, or baking them in loaves of bread, which aroused no suspicion. The mountain village of Apeiranthos on Naxos, of which Colin became very fond, was key player in the looting networks. I remember vividly my first visit to the coffee shop in the main square. The waiter asked me politely how I came to be in the village. My intentionally vague reply on business brought his second query. If I may ask, what business? When I said that I was an archaeologist, an archaeologos, he bent over and whispered confidentially and conspiratorially to me, don't say that, because the police are after them. Of course, archaeokapili come here now, and then I'm sorry. Of course, archaeokapili come here now, and then that they are civil servants. Then it dawned on me that for the villagers, the term archaeokapilos, which with its ancient overtones meant a state official, whereas Archaeologos was an illegal trafficker in antiquities. This was the Monty Python situation at the time. While touring the rural areas of Naxos, I came across dozens of early Cycladic cemeteries with looted schist graves of trapezoidal plan and light with schist slabs. No, sorry. I described in my records the picture I beheld. I excavated and documented any undisturbed graves and the cemetery with photographs, plans, and sketches. There were also cases, especially sorry. There were also cases, especially close to roadways, where the only indications of the existence of an early Cycladic cemetery were the schist slabs from the revetment of the graves piled up on the margins of the recently plowed area, so as to give the impression that this was a cultivated field. No doubt, Colin Renfrew too witnessed such situations, which may well have triggered his abhorrence and condemnation of looting, a cause he championed so vocally in international fora. Among the victims of looting, which Colin was to investigate many years later in the major project, was the uninhabited island of Keros, one of the small archipelago of the so-called Lesser Cyclades, to the southeast of Naxos. Difficult to access and rumored to be the provenance of most of the figurines circulating in the market. I went by kaiki to Epanokofonisi and spent the night there so as to make the crossing in another fishing boat the next morning. While talking to by the light of an oil lamp, there was no electricity on the island yet, with the owners of the house where I was staying, I learned that the person who knew all about what was going on Keros was the priest. Indeed, the priest put me in the picture, explaining to me the types of figurines found there and arousing my suspicions that he knew more about the trafficking of them than he let on. The next day, when I arrived at the location he had told me about, I saw for myself the destructive looting that the island had suffered. Thousands of fragments of figurines scattered all over the place, churned up from the earth over many hectares. They reminded me of potatoes uprooted by a mechanical plow. I collected a few thousand fragments of them, which I deposited to the Archaeological Museum of Naxos. Thanks to this work on Keros, I got to know better local people in Epano Koufonisi and enjoy kakavia on Kavos, kakavia ston Kavo, a special soup made from a variety of small fish caught by Captain Kostas and his son. The material I collected during this stage of my professional life was the subject of my doctoral thesis, Burial Habits in the Cyclades on the 3rd millennium BC, supervised by Professor John Evans at the Institute of Archaeology in London. John Evans was co-excavator with Colin on the Neolithic settlement on the islet of Saliagos, off Antiparos, which they published promptly and in exemplary manner, giving us a model of interdisciplinary research, excavations at Saliagos near Antiparos, London, 1968. This data and my thoughts of them, particularly with regard to chronology, were shared and discussed with Colin, who was gathering information for his own studies. His great strong point was methodology, his remarkable ability to synthesize and to see the bigger picture. This is apparent from his publications, such as the article Crete on the Cyclades before Rhadamanthus in Critica Chronica, 1964. His PhD dissertation, the Neolithic and Early Bronze Age culture in the Cyclades and their external relations, submitted to the University of Cambridge in April 1965, and subsequently the core of his opus magnum on our beloved islands, The Emergence of Civilisation. Colin's background in the natural sciences was groundbreaking for Cycladic archaeology in the 1960s, with studies such as Cycladic metallurgy and the Aegean Early Bronze Age, published in the American Journal of Archaeology in 1967. Obsidian in the Aegean, published in the Annual of British School at Athens, 1965, which he authored with J.R. Kahn and J.A. Dixon, and together with J.S. P.C., Aegean Marble, a petrological study, published in the Annual of the British School at Athens in 1968. For me personally, the chronology and classification of the early Cycladic figurines, published in the American Journal of Archaeology, volume 73, 1969, pages 1 to 32, holds a special place, not least in the light of the looting of which I was eyewitness, and of some of my own finds, such as the figurines from Plastiras, alas stolen from the Paros Archaeological Museum many years ago, which expanded the time frame for these distinctive artifacts. The combination of my own chronological inquiries based largely in the study of early Cycladic pottery with Colin's systematic classification of the figurines helped me enormously in studying the Goulandris collection. The legislation in Greece in the 1960s permitted both dealing in antiquities of undocumented precise provenance and the establishing of private collections mentored by the Department of Private Collections of the Archaeological Service. On this legal basis, the then Director of Antiquities, Ioannis Papadimitriou, granted a permit to the Goulandris couple, Nikolaos and Ekaterini Doli, to form a collection of antiquities and indeed encourage them to focus on early Cycladic figurines, which were being smuggled out of Greece. And this was in hundreds and supplying the international market. Let's wonder how the infamous Mr. Stern and Mr. Steinhardt managed to accumulate so many stolen treasures. The shipping magnates, Nikolaos and Doli Goulandris, were thus able to purchase legitimately and directly Cycladic artifacts from villagers and looters, and furthermore, with their yacht, they were able to drop anchor in havens of any island. In addition, they bought Cycladic figurines that appeared at auctions abroad, and so brought them back to Greece. It is worth pointing out that Papadimitriou's bold move not only brought a decrease in the looting of early Cycladic cemeteries and the illicit export of early Cycladic artworks, but also the gathering of such pieces under one roof, making them accessible for the future study, albeit bereft of details about their original context. Appointed by the service as curator of this collection of Cycladica, I was faced with the task of inventorying and then trying to put some order into what was essentially a hodgepodge of beautiful bibelots. And the interaction of Colin's typological groundwork and my experience from excavation in the field was decisive for their classification, which resulted in the scientific catalogue that was the basis for organizing the permanent exhibition in the Museum of Cycladic Art, so tastefully designed by Greek architect Ioannis Bikelas. Colin very soon became fluent in modern Greek, and his brief, exciting announcement about the excavation on the islet of Saliagos in the strait between Paros and Antiparos, written on a postcard dated 18 of July 1964, indicates. Οι ανασκαφές, that was in Greece, οι ανασκαφές προχωράνε καλά. Ο Σάλιαγκος είναι βεβαίως της νεολιθικής εποχής και βρίσκουμε πολλές αιχμές βελών. Έχει και αγία με γραπτή διακόσμηση, αλλά κουκλάκια δεν υπάρχουν. Our correspondence continued over the years with the exchange of long letters in English but of shorter messages mainly on postcards in Greek. In a letter dated the 3rd of February 1965, Colin writes, "Shortly, I shall be starting an article on chronology, and perhaps I shall then have all kinds of problems to ask you. But meanwhile, the most important piece of news is that Jane and I are to be married on April 21st, so that we shall be properly wedded by the time we come out to Greece in May. It will be wonderful to be in Greece again. I have missed the Cyclades a good deal this winter." In another postcard dated 27 of June 1965, sent from Naxos, he writes, «Μόλις φτάσαμε στην Άξο για το πανηγύρι της Απεράτου. Θα γυρίσουμε στην Αθήνα, Αντίπαρο τη Δευτέρα και για την Αθήνα Τρίτη πρωί». In a letter of December 65, Colin informed me that he is preparing an article in which he distinguishes the early Bronze Age in the Cyclades into three cultures, as opposed to the conventional tripartite chronological sequence, which he designates Grota Pylos culture, Keros Syros culture, and Phylakopi one culture. Yet another of his lasting contributions to Aegean archaeology, because he wanted to show with this the spread and the Cycladic culture, and this culture was unique. Colin showed his love for Greece and the Greeks in many ways. In addition to his fluency to Greek, he was never happier than in company of the local people who took him to heart and called him O Kyrios Kolis. He enjoyed participating in their celebrations, their glendia, singing and dancing to island tunes. He was particularly fond of Pende pende deka, deka kate venutas kalia, which he sang with gusto and at every opportunity. Although he was a member of the Conservative Party in the UK and indeed appointed as a peer of the real Lord Renfrew of Kensington, he never hesitated to express his liberal opinions. While we were discussing politics one day in central Athens, in the turbulent times of the treacherous downfall of the government of George Papandreou, his views seemed to me so liberal by Greek standards that I had to advise him not to speak loudly because he might be considered to be a communist. His immediate reaction was one of alarm. Me, a communist? But he grasped the Greek predicament. Once I was a British Council scholar in London at the Institute of Archaeology working on my doctoral thesis, the fateful coup took place in Greece. Colin was a passionate defender of democracy and understood my concerns. He never stopped sending messages against it. The most moving is a postcard I received from him for the 25th of March, 1971, the 150th anniversary of the outbreak of the Greek revolution, in which he experienced his sadness that on that momentous day, Greece was living through a military dictatorship. After my return to Greece in 1968 and my posting in Santorini, Colin visited the site at Akrotiri on several occasions, and his input in organizing the later FIRA conferences, so generously hosted by the late Peter Nomikos, was invaluable. In the 1970s, I visited his excavations at Phylakopi, where, incidentally, my late brother-in-law was a postgrad member of the team, and my sister-in-law was cook. In fact, it was at Phylakopi in July 1977 that news reached me of the birth of my son, which we celebrated together. Happily, our friendship extended to our families. We spent several short breaks together on Antiparos, in those days far from cosmopolitan, which Colin and Jane got to know when excavating on the uninhabited islet of Saliagos. We always stayed at the Avra Hotel, the prospicious of which the Morakis family were kumbari of Colin. He was godfather of their grandson. As for myself, I feel privileged to have enjoyed Colin's friendship and for the honor of being godfather to his youngest son, Magnus, whom, along with his sister, his children and his sister, Helena, I welcome here today. Colin Renfrew leaves behind him not only an impressive academic legacy for future generations of researchers involved in the study of human history, but also the fondest of memories of those of us blessed to have known him personally. Thank you very much.
Thank you hugely, Christos, for those really warm and entertaining words. It was really a wonderful insight into Colin's early period in Greece and indeed their friendship too, and how much they meant to each other. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Marisa Marthari, who is going to talk about Colin's work in the Cyclades. Marisa, please.
Αξιότιμη κύριε Πρέσβη, κυρίες και κύριοι, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι, καλησπέρα σας. It is emotionally difficult for me to speak tonight about Colin Renfrew, a unique personality of international stature and influence, with whom I had the honor and privilege to collaborate, and through that collaboration, to develop a deep appreciation for him as a person. Renfrew was the world's foremost archaeologist of our time, yet his heart was firmly rooted in the Cyclades, those small islands at the center of the Aegean. In particular, the archaeologists and the archaeology of the Cyclades owe him a lot, since he is the one who raised the prehistory of those islands to the heights of scholarly knowledge, and at the same time fought passionately against the plundering of antiquities there. Renfrew formed a deep bond with the Cyclades during his youth, when he came to the British School at Athens in 1962-63 as a doctoral student. It was then that he met Nikolaos Zafiropoulos, the author of Antiquities for the Cyclades, who granted him permission to undertake surface surveys across the islands in search of prehistoric sites. In this way, he traversed the major Cycladic islands for the first time, visiting all the known prehistoric locations, while also identifying several that had previously been unrecorded. In many Cycladic museums, there are shards bearing his handwritten notes, enduring traces of those early surveys. Renfrew was already reading Greek, and while studying Zafiropoulos' reports on the Cycladic antiquities in the official journal of the Archaeological Service, the Archaeologikon Deltion, he noticed that two large obsidian cores had been found on the islet of Saliagos, just off Antiparos. He therefore visited the islet and, recognizing its significance, carried out his first excavation there in 1963 and 1964, together with John Evans, with the permission and active encouragement of Zafiropoulos, for whom he always retained great esteem and affection. Saliagos is the first Neolithic site to be identified in the Cycladic Islands, and it was on the assemblage of artifacts recovered from that excavation that Renfrew based his definition of the Saliagos culture. The excavation team lived on Antiparos and traveled back and forth each day to Saliagos by a small fishing boat. In this way, both he and Jane formed a lasting bond with the people of Antiparos, a relationship that endured over time, and from then on, they visited the island whenever they had the chance. Those years proved decisive in shaping his close relationship with Cycladic archaeology, with the land itself and with its people. It was during that period that he also came to know his Greek colleagues, Christos Doumas, Fotini Zafiropoulou, and Lila Marangou, with whom he forged deep friendships and collaborated productively in the years that followed. In 1965, he completed his PhD thesis, Neolithic and Bronze Age Cultures of the Cyclades and their External Relations, thereby firmly establishing his scholarly connection with these islands. In 1972, his groundbreaking and most influential book, The Emergence of Civilisation, was published, which became like a Bible for us when we were students. The writing of the book took several years, and although the treatment of early Cycladic material was based on his thesis, many other topics were added under the influence of social archaeology, which was then still considered the new archaeology. However, we will hear a special lecture on these topics later by Cyprian. During the years 1974-1977, while Renfrew was professor of archaeology at the University of Southampton, he carried out excavations at Phylakopi on Melos, an emblematic site in Aegean archaeology. These were the third series of excavations conducted there under the auspices of the British School at Athens. Renfrew entered this final phase of research on Melos, which resulted in a trilogy of highly significant studies of Melian and Aegean prehistory with two principal aims. The first was to understand the environment of a prehistoric town and the island subsystem to which it belonged. The second was to integrate the phases of Phylakopi into the current chronological framework for the Aegean, a framework developed after the first period of excavations at Phylakopi. For the first aim, advanced field methods for the time were employed, including, among other approaches, a surface survey of the entire island of Melos. The outcome was the publication of the groundbreaking volume, An Island Polity, The Archaeology of Exploitation in Melos, 1982, edited by Renfrew and Malcolm Wagstaff, with distinguished contributions, among them those of John Cherry and Robin Torrens. To achieve the second aim, a thorough stratigraphical investigation was carried out within the town itself at selected points, which brought to light a highly significant architectural complex that earlier excavators had not discovered. This was the Mycenaean sanctuary, to which the volume The Archaeology of Cult, the Sanctuary at Phylakopi, 1985, was dedicated. Bold and dynamic, Renfrew did not hesitate in this volume to tackle all the religious issues that troubled Aegean prehistory and to develop a new perspective of religion in the Aegean region. The remaining research focused on the Megaron, the area of the East Pillar Room, and the city's fortification wall, all of which were detailed in the final volume. This book rests on a significant interdisciplinary collaboration, showcasing the leading figures of Aegean prehistory and demonstrating, among other things, Renfrew's skill in selecting excellent colleagues. In 1981, Renfrew was elected Disney Professor of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and despite the heavy demands of this position, he succeeded in carrying out, together with Christos Doumas and Lila Marangou, two important research projects on Amorgos and Keros. His collaborators now belonged to a younger generation, yet were once again of exceptional caliber. On Amorgos, the multi-phase early Cycladic settlement at Markiani was excavated to exemplary standards. This excavation is invaluable, for it provided us with substantial data of early Cycladic settlements, very few of which have been excavated even to this day. On Keros, a small-scale excavation was conducted in the looted area, along with the first ever systematic surface survey of the entire Kavos area. The results of these investigations are particularly significant, but this will be further discussed by Michael. The results were published in two important volumes, which you have already seen from these two researchers. In the 1990s, Colin's demanding duties at the University of Cambridge kept him away from the Cyclades. We had, in a sense, lost him from the islands. In 1999, by which time I had become the author of Antiquities for the Cyclades and Samos, I invited him and Jane to attend the opening of the Museum of Eos, and to my delight, they came. It was the first sign of his return. He told me that he wished to see Skarkos, the exceptionally well-preserved settlement from the height of the early Cycladic era I had been fortunate enough to identify and excavate on the island, together with its artifacts that form the core of the museum's displays. From that time on, he visited me several more times on Eos, even during the excavation itself. Here he is shown holding a teeny figurine of the Apeirontos type, which had just been found. The second sign of his return to the islands was his participation in the International Sifnian Symposium held in 2002 on Sifnos. There he spoke on chronological issues concerning the early Cycladic cemetery at Akrotiri. The third and final sign of his now dynamic return to the Cyclades was his wish to organize a conference at which all ongoing archaeological research in the islands in the early 2000s could be presented. And also, in 2004, we all traveled to Cambridge, where a truly significant conference was held, covering without exception all the then recent investigations in the Cyclades. The proceedings of this Origin, a colloquium on the prehistory of the Cyclades, published in 2008, stand as a landmark in the study of Cycladic prehistory. In 2004, he retired and finally had the time to devote himself as much and in whatever way he wished to his developed places, to his beloved places. Excuse me. At the time, he expressed to me his desire to excavate Aspedos on Naxos. I then suggested that he should instead choose Keros, including Daskalion, with its important antiquities, which had previously suffered damage from antiquities looting and where he had already worked in the late 1980s. Fortunately, he was convinced because the valuable excavations, surface surveys, and interdisciplinary research projects he conducted there in the 2000s and 2010s, many of which have already been extensively published, have breathed new life and given a significant impulse to the Bronze Age Cycladic archaeology. However, the next speaker will present these investigations to you in detail. Renfrew was deeply affected by the destruction of the early Cycladic antiquities due to clandestine excavation, especially on Keros. This led him to devote himself alongside his scholarly work to fighting the illicit trafficking of antiquities on an international level. In 1996, he even founded a research center on this subject, the Illicit Antiquities Research Center, which he set up under the auspices of the MacDonald Institute at the University of Cambridge. The center published an important journal and organized dynamic conferences, such as the one in which I took part, representing Greece in 1998. You can see the proceeding of this conference on the screen. In 2011, the Badisches Landesmuseum in Karlsruhe, one of the principal museums holding early Cycladic antiquities without archaeological context, organized an exhibition on early Cycladic culture. They sought the loan of ancient artifacts from Greece and invited us to contribute texts. All the archaeologists of the Ephorate for the Cyclades, the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and the General Directorate of Antiquities refused to participate, and the directors, likewise, declined to send any antiquities. Immediately, Colin Renfrew and Christos Doumas came to our support with letters. Colin even traveled to Athens, delivered a lecture on this issue, and played a leading role in ensuring that the German museum ultimately and formally agreed to adhere to the principles of the 1970 UNESCO Convention and to return to Greece two Cycladic antiquities, namely a chloride frying pan with relief spiral decoration and a large marble figurine, both of which had been purchased after 1970. Together, and with the collaboration of Michael Boyle, we organized two conferences on early Cycladic marble figurines from excavations in the Cyclades and other areas in the Aegean in 2014 and 2015, respectively. This resulted in the publication of 2 volumes in which all the marble figurines found in secure archaeological contexts were published, from both the Cyclades themselves and from other regions of the Aegean. Cycladic prehistory belongs, unfortunately, to those fields of archaeology in which reference works, especially on marble figurines and vessels, are all too often catalogs of private collections, many of which include forgeries. With this pair of monographs, however, this gap has now been filled, and we can henceforth refer with confidence in our studies to two books presenting exclusively Cycladic antiquities preserved in context. No matter how much one writes, it is impossible to describe Colin Renfrew's catalytic scholarly presence in the Cycladic archipelago. Moreover, the presence he had on these islands as a person was a very warm and very special one. For us, Greek archaeologists, as well as for the residents of the islands where he worked and lived, the Antiparians, the Kufonisians, the Amorgians, the Melians, he was a person close to their hearts. He spoke our language and liked to live on the islands like the Cycladic people. He always entered every tiring day of excavation with rakomelo, a local drink combining raki with honey, in the company of the captain who, in the mornings, transported his excavation team from Kufonisi to Keros. He never started his evening meal without raising a glass of ouzo with his dinner partners. At Cycladic feasts, he danced the balos, the popular Cycladic dance he loved so much, often with his close friend Fotinis Ephorate. Beloved Colin, having passed away a year ago, has left a void in global European, Aegean, and Cycladic archaeology, but also left an emptiness in our souls that will never be filled. I thank you and leave you to enjoy Colin and Fotini dancing on Kufonisi in September 2013 in the video by Michael Boyd that follows.
Thank you so much, Marisa. Most of the audience is now in tears, I think. A wonderful, warm, and excellent presentation that really gives us a wonderful insight into Colin's work in the Cyclades. Michael Boyd, top that.
I'm not sure anyone can top that. Good evening to everyone. Thank you all for coming, and especially to our distinguished guests at the front here. Much has been said about Colin Renfrew tonight and in print since his death about a year ago. Reading the many appreciations that have been published gives one a sense of the many roles that he fulfilled in world archaeology and what he meant to people around the world. In the Cyclades and the wider Aegean, he found one of his true passions, and he devoted much of his professional and personal life to the Cycladic islands. Tonight, I will consider his work on Keros, his last and greatest fieldwork project. Colin Renfrew spent some time as a schoolboy in Paris, and he learned to speak French well, something of which he was very proud. He also, as he said, got to know the Louvre very well, and one of its more enigmatic exhibits, a large prehistoric marble head of simple and elegant form, said to be from the island of Keros in the Cyclades, subsequently loomed large in his life's course. The young Colin Renfrew was deeply struck by the sculpture. After graduating from Cambridge, he decided to begin a PhD looking into what was then the rather obscure 3rd millennium BCE in the Cyclades. In this, he was perhaps prompted by Christian Zerbos' 1957 book, L'Art des Cyclades, itself born of the influence of Cycladic sculpture had begun to have on 20th century art. For his PhD, he saw an opportunity in the Cyclades because at that time it was an under-researched field. He traveled in the Cyclades as part of his research, having in his pocket, as he always liked to point out, and as we've already heard, I think twice tonight, a permit from Nikolaos Zafiropoulos, then Ephorate. The Cyclades were not well frequented by travelers in those days and difficult to travel around. But these experiences became pivotal in Renfrew's life. He would often recount with great pleasure the experience of Apokries and Apiranthos, or travel by donkey, or sleeping in an aloni at night. All these pictures, I think, are from Naxos. This trip included, of course, his famous first visit to Keros. As I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, Keros is a today uninhabited island in the very center of the Aegean, surrounded by the small Cyclades and larger islands such as Naxos and Amorgos. Our area of interest is at the western end of the island, and for orientation, here we are looking south with the islet of Daskalio, which in the 3rd millennium was a promontory. And in the foreground, the site of the looted area. Alerted by Christos Dumas, as we have heard tonight, and preceded by him by a few days, he visited this precise area on the 24th of July, 1963, although this particular slide shows that he also made it to the summit of the island as well. While the family which then resided on Keros at Konakia might have been reluctant to reveal a source of their income, it seems they didn't take him off in entirely the wrong direction. And Colin records finding the site after only an hour. The material he collected that day, which he deposited in the Naxos Museum, played a clear role in the development of his culture sequences for his PhD. There you see the material as he collected it in the field. And there we see it officially photographed. This remarkably included 3 figurine fragments in marble, as well as a large number of marble vessel fragments. Renfrew went on to complete his PhD, which I will not dwell on here, as I think Cyprian will cover the transformation of this work into his seminal book, The Emergence of Civilisation. The contents show how he arranged his research by defining a culture sequence, and what he started off calling the Syros culture ended up being the Keros Syros culture, demonstrating what an impact the site at Keros had had on him. The discussion of the Keros Syros culture shows us important themes, which I've circled on the left here. Metal and the international spirit. But I also wanted to show that on the right, Renfrew is still referring to the site as a cemetery. Later in the chapter, he points out, however, how unusual a site it is. He discusses the question of whether it might indeed have been a workshop instead. In the eventual catalogue entry, at the back of the Emergence of Civilisation, it's still being referred to as a cemetery. Fast forward to 1983, however, and after the discovery of the Mycenaean sanctuary at Phylakopi on Melos, which Marisa has just told us about, a new interpretation for Keros was beginning to brew. And the idea that further work is necessary at the site has also sort of come to the boil. What you see here is the proceedings of the 1983 British Museum Colloquium, and in particular, the discussion around the need for more work to understand Keros. Around this time, Renfrew was working on his volume on Phylakopi, The Archaeology of Cults, and his ideas about prehistoric religion were beginning to crystallize. The idea that Keros could have been a sanctuary was born, and his determination to investigate this idea can be seen to have its roots here. This brings us to the first of a series of projects on Keros, directed or co-directed by Colin Renfrew. The rather grandly titled Inter-University Project for Research on Amorgos and Keros was directed by Renfrew, Christos Dumas, and Lila Marangou. And here you see them on the boat on the way to Keros in this very well-known photograph. If we return here to the layout of the site, in 1987, the looted area, which was then simply called the Special Deposit, you see there at the front, the Special Deposit South had not been located at that point. Todd Whitelaw directed a small survey just of the Kavos area, which not surprisingly demonstrated plenty of material on the ground. The results of this survey were significant in offering an idea of the extent of human activity in the area, considerably larger than the area affected by the looting. And this led to subsequent long-running discussions about the nature of the site, which remain relevant even today. Meanwhile, new excavations were undertaken in the looted area itself in search of any remaining stratigraphy, which, however, was not successfully found. For Colin, the most important result of this project was the realization that all of the marble material had been broken in antiquity, as explained in this chapter, grandly entitled Thravmatology, for which Renfrew was an indicator of the ritual nature of the deposition of these materials. This was far from the only result of the project, of course. Cyprian Broodbank's study of the ceramics allowed us to begin to see the broad scope of imports at the site, and went on to inform his own wider studies of early Cycladic development. For the period from 1990 to 2006, Colin was extremely busy as founding director of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, Master of Jesus College in Cambridge, and politically as a member of the House of Lords, as well as maintaining his research work in many archaeological fields, developing new concepts such as cognitive archaeology or material engagement theory. The award of the Balzan Prize in 2004 and retirement from the directorship of the MacDonald Institute finally gave him the freedom to pursue definitive and large-scale work on Keros. He undertook a 3-year project with Olga Filaniotou as associate director and his colleagues Neil Brodie and Yorgos Gavalas as assistant directors, and a new generation of young specialists and research students. Work on Keros focused on the area to the south of the looted area, and in particular, as we can see in this photograph from 1963, on an area lacking in vegetation, which turned out to be a sort of a cairn, a pile of stones. This was the area of the Special Deposit South, and you can still see some of the stones from the cairn on the balks here in the excavation. Removal of the soil revealed a flat area of aeolianite bedrock, which had formed the focal point for the deposition of broken figurine fragments, as well as other choice materials, such as marble vessel fragments, fragments of sauce boats and conical neck jars, and obsidian. This slide shows us the density of the material within the Special Deposit South. And of course, being unlooted, the excavation of this area allowed for a careful interpretation of the formation processes through human action of this almost unique archaeological site. For Colin Renfrew, the recovery of so many fragments of folded arm figurines was the closure of a circle that had begun with that head in the Louvre in Paris in the 1950s. It went on through this article, which we have had referred already this evening in the American Journal of Archaeology in 1969, and latterly his publication with Marisa and myself, which we have also seen this evening, of early Cycladic sculpture in context. It also allowed Colin the great satisfaction of publishing a huge catalogue of unlooted Cycladic figurine fragments, giving a solid underpinning to discussions of form and manufacture, which hitherto had relied too heavily on material of questionable provenance. Study of the figurines led to the realization that only one fragment of each figure or each vessel was eventually deposited in the special deposit. For Colin, this was definitive. This site was the earliest maritime sanctuary in the world. The slide we see here is one of Colin's own slides from one of his own PowerPoints, as is this. Keros was a center of congregation comparable to Stonehenge or Göbekli Tepe. Two publications of 2012 and 2013 were, for Colin, definitive, and his final word, representing for him the end of the debate over the nature of Keros. He began the 2013 publication with the words, "The research project I would like to discuss with you today has been gestating for the last 50 years. And he ends with the statement that Keros has to be placed among the other well-known centers of congregation in prehistory, where convocation and sometimes monumental construction were features of a new social order. We should not underestimate the significance of these conclusions for what Colin saw as a 50-year project." Colin's achievements at Keros include, as we will see in a moment in Evie's talk, the idea of a large interdisciplinary project and the promotion of the work of younger scholars. Here we see just some of the many people who became part of that project. In the publication of his Balzan lecture, he celebrated this collaborative work, including the highlighting some of the speakers here today. And we should not forget the monumental publication effort, a key part of my own role at Colin's side in Cambridge for 15 years, with the support of the MacDonald Institute and its successive directors. The 2006 to 2008 Keros project led directly to a collaborative project with the Ephorates, co-directed with Marisa Marthari and Caterina Della Porta, the survey of the island of Keros, to begin to contextualize the phenomenon of import highlighted over the years by Cyprian Broodbank, Jill Hilditch, and Peggy Sotorakopoulou. Evidence of human activity move on quickly. Evidence of human activity on Keros over the millennia was more intensive than might first have been expected. This led us to think of a more expansive survey, taking into account maritime travel and sampling a potential maritime unit. So here it is. Here you see the shared density in the three areas that we sampled, Naxos, Katakouphonissi, and Keros, indicating Katakouphonissi as a hotspot. Focusing on the third millennium, the survey indicates clear areas of focus beyond Daskalio and Kavos, a real third millennium landscape. And perhaps more surprisingly, the late fourth to early third millennium BCE landscape is also well populated, undermining any concept of Keros as uninhabited before the special deposits. Now let's turn to Daskalio, where work began in 2007 and 2008, but whose importance only really became apparent during the 2016 to 2018 fieldwork. The earlier work concentrated on the summit, but from 2016 we began to investigate the full extent of the site. Radiocarbon and ceramic studies established a three-phase chronology for the site, which recent work has extended slightly in both directions. While the buildings on the summit could be interpreted as potentially public or central buildings, the extent of planning on the site only became clear as excavations proceeded. Much of the north and east of the islet was densely built on a system of terraces, and the purpose of these buildings did not appear to be simply domestic. Evidence for metallurgy is very densely distributed on Daskalio, and moreover is found on Keros as well, though clearly not in the area of the special deposits. Several metallurgical workshops have been located, and many other finds indicating the prevalence of metalworking throughout the site. All of the characteristics of metalworking on Daskalio and Keros place it among the very few metalworking centres of the Aegean. We noted briefly the importance Colin placed on metalworking from his doctoral research. Once again, with the discovery of the metalworking centre of Daskalio, he closed the circle of his life's research. Here he is in 2019 at the opening of the Keros exhibition on Koufonisi with the mayor of Naxos and the small Cyclades, Dimitris Lianos. This is one of my favourite pictures of Colin explaining Keros to the world. And here we see him again in 2020 at the world premiere of the Cosmote TV and National Geographic film on Keros in London, just before COVID brought all of our worlds to a halt. The work on Keros, which is far from finished, rewrote for a second time the story of the emergence of civilization in the Aegean. The work goes on. This year, we began a new collaborative project with the Ephorate to investigate both prehistoric and Byzantine Keros. This is a great part of Colin Renfrew's legacy. His work continues, and it falls to us, his students and colleagues, to attempt to rise to the enormous challenge, to be worthy of his vision, and to continue to unravel the ever more complex and fascinating picture of Keros, which Colin began to puzzle over in 1963. We who love the Cyclades, their culture, history, and heritage, lived in blessed times that we were led by Colin Renfrew. It is undoubtedly true to say that we shall not see his like again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And it's fabulous to see how Colin's impact on so many people is still being felt through the Keros project and other projects. It's the turn of Eddie Margaritis, please, who is talking about Colin and archaeological science in Greece and worldwide.
Good evening. In the next 15 minutes, and it's going to be 15 minutes, I will talk about Colin Renfrew and archaeological science. So, I first met Colin Renfrew when he was serving as director of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at Cambridge. I will begin by acknowledging his major contribution to archaeological science through the establishment of this pioneering research center. At the time, back in the early 2000s, I rarely interacted with him. I was intimidated and never quite knew what to say when he was around. Things improved slightly once we began to meet more often, especially since Jane Renfrew, the renowned archaeobotanist, was my PhD advisor. What I didn't realize then was that Colin Renfrew would go on to change the course of my life, as he did for so many others. But let's continue with facts. The MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research was founded in 1990 following a major benefaction from Dr. MacDonald, a successful industrialist and founder of the DSR group, which manufactured record turntables. His endowment allowed the University of Cambridge to establish a purpose-built center dedicated to advancing archaeological science. The institute was envisioned as a hub for archaeological science, hosting laboratories for geoarchaeology, archaeozoology, archaeobotany, artifact analysis, and related fields. It promoted interdisciplinary collaboration, fieldwork, and research initiatives around the globe. As a founding director, Colin Renfrew played a decisive role in shaping its scholarly character. From its inception, the MacDonald Institute also launched the Cambridge Archaeological Journal alongside the MacDonald Monograph series and regular support for conferences, workshops, and seminars. Professor Renfrew retired as the director of the MacDonald Institute, and before his retirement in 2004, he announced that he will end his career with the launch of the new excavation at Keros. But we'll come back to this. Going backwards, and in the beginning of his career, after completing national service, Renfrew went to Cambridge to study natural sciences. However, after his first year, and following conversation with Glyn Daniel, then editor of the Antiquity Journal, he switched to archaeology. With hindsight, the move seemed almost inventable. He already had a strong interest in the ancient world, a fascination with antiquities, and had spent several summers participating in archaeological excavation. So upon graduating, he began a PhD on the little understood 3rd millennium BC Cyclades. Although he entered archaeology through an interest in the ancient world, it was Renfrew's scientific background that came to define his work throughout the 60s and 70s. Dissatisfied with the subjective explanation that dominated archaeological interpretation at the time, he turned to emerging scientific methods. In a series of groundbreaking papers, he employed elemental characterization to analyze the provenance and technology of materials and championed the use of radiometric dating techniques, especially radiocarbon. This insight formed the core of his 1973 book, Before Civilization, The Radiocarbon Revolution in Prehistoric Europe, in which he demonstrated the long-established explanations for cultural change were not only flawed but fundamentally untenable, as the calibrated chronologies dramatically reshaped the timelines of prehistoric Europe. His seminal 1968 article, Wessex Without Mycenae, fundamentally challenged the long-held archaeological belief that the sophistication of the Wessex Bronze Age culture in southern Britain, including monumental sites like Stonehenge, was a result of direct infusion or influence from the advanced Mycenaean civilization in Greece. By leveraging the new and more accurate radiocarbon dating method, Renfrew demonstrated a significant chronological gap, estimated to be centuries, between the height of the Wessex culture and the flourishing of Mycenaean Greece, thereby dissolving the supposed link. This meant the development of the Wessex culture had to be understood as an independent, indigenous phenomenon, establishing its complex social and technological achievements locally and marking a crucial shift in a European prehistory away from reliance on the diffusionist model that viewed all progress as radiating from the civilized Near East and the Aegean. He focused very early on obsidian characterization in the Mediterranean using chemical fingerprinting to identify the geological source of obsidian artifacts. By analyzing trace elements, allowed archaeologists to reconstruct ancient trade and exchange networks with far greater precision. That study became a landmark example of how scientific techniques can illuminate prehistoric social and economic interactions. Focusing on early on the metallurgy of the Cyclades around the same time, he published Cycladic metallurgy in the Aegean Bronze Age, highlighting the central and early importance of the Cycladic islands in the development of metalworking across the Aegean, primarily during the early Bronze Age II period. Challenging earlier notions of diffusion from the Near East, Renfrew argued that the Cyclades developed an indigenous metallurgical tradition, drawing on local mineral resources like copper, lead, and silver from islands such as Kythnos and Sifnos. His work, Aegean marble and petrographical study, investigated the mineralogical and textural characteristics of marble used in prehistoric Aegean artifacts. By examining thin sections under the microscope, Renfrew was able to distinguish marbles from different quarry sources. This helped clarify patterns of production, exchange, and craftsmanship specialization in early Aegean societies. Very early, already in the 70s, he touched upon and published in areas which would form the basis of archaeological science related questions until today. Trade routes through isotope analysis, radiocarbon and obsidian sources I already mentioned, erosion, paleoenvironmental reconstruction, and provenance. I'm not going to touch on the emergence, since Professor Broodbank will address it shortly. What is important to understand, however, is that through his earlier work, and of course in the emergence as an important milestone, Renfrew strongly advocated integrating archaeological science into fieldwork. He applied these principles in his excavations at Saliagos, Phylakopi, and later Markiani, embedding scientific methods into his excavation design. As a result, he produced one of the first systematically collected assemblages of plant, animal, geoarchaeological, and other materials evidence in these Cyclades. Among other work, in the textbook Archaeology Theories, Methods and Practice, co-authored by Paul Bunn, we focused on methods and practice in order to integrate archaeological science in the field with chapters on dating and chronology, environmental archaeology, on technology, on cognitive archaeology, and on bioarchaeology. Another vein of his interest was archaeogenetics, in the framing of the DNA revolution in archaeology. He understood the potential, he was very enthusiastic about it, and wanted to promote. Therefore, his edited volume, Archaeogenetics, DNA and the Population Prehistory of Europe, explores how genetic evidence can illuminate the deep human past of Europe. The volume examines how ancient DNA, combined with archaeology and linguistics, helps reconstruct early migration, population changes, and cultural developments. His promotion of archaeological science, both through advocating its integration in fieldwork and through his widely taught publications, has had a profound impact on future generations of archaeologists. This influence is especially evident in Greece, where a new generation of professionals and students continue to adapt and develop these scientific approaches. If we consider what I presented and what the previous speakers have contributed, and the many other projects Renfrew was engaged in, we can imagine them as forming a circle. That circle comes together in a major milestone of Renfrew's research and turning point in Cycladic archaeology, the Horizon Conference back in 2004, as Marisa already mentioned. It was there that he announced his return to Keros, one of his final acts as director of the MacDonald Institute. We heard a lot about Keros, but I will focus only on the archaeological science aspect. From the very first excavation in 2006, Renfrew brought together specialties in obsidian, metallurgy, environmental archaeology, isotopes, marble provenance, bioarchaeology, micromorphology, and ceramic petrography. In the following season, this grew even further with soil chemistry, ancient DNA, residue analysis, proteomics, starch analysis on groundstone tools, and pottery and microware analysis. What he created at Keros was an environment of opportunity for young researchers. At the same time, most of us had just completed our PhDs, many were still working on their dissertations, and some had not even begun. Now, 20 years later, that first core team has moved into academic and research positions, and I believe Keros played a major role in that progression. Mirto Georgakopoulou, our Mirto, was one of the first people that was doing archaeological science at Keros. I began this paper with a personal experience, and this last part will remain personal. On site, Professor Renfrew knew exactly how to ask questions. He pushed for answers that matched his rigorous logic. He had very clear ideas about how things should be done, and everyone who knew him will relate to this. For example, he wanted to understand why samples kept for residue analysis could not be stored in direct contact with plastic bags. The explanation that this is the protocol was not enough, and he wanted the exact chemical reasoning and the precise why. Although he trusted us with the study of the material, he also had a very specific vision of how things should proceed, and everything how to follow the optimal timetable. He did not want, for example, to move the water sealing samples from Daskaliou to Keros, where we actually had space to process and sort them. Instead, he wanted to do it right there on rocky Daskaliou, and we had to demonstrate that this was simply not possible. But before that, he would go around and say to the team, I don't understand why Evie does not like my innovative ideas. On the slide, you can see Professor Renfrew with Professor Dumas back in 2006, and a bunch of us being very happy at the CAIC from or to Keros. And Andreas Vlachopoulos is taking the photograph. When Andreas first started visiting Keros, and he hasn't stopped since, we would complain to him about the food and all sorts of other things, including Professor Renfrew himself. Back then, we were young and a bit fiery. I remember being with Ioanna Moutafi when Andreas told us, all the things you are describing do not matter. Soon you will realize what a great opportunity it is to be part of Keros. Very soon afterwards, we understood just how right he was. Colin Renfrew had an extraordinary academic life, but what I want to remember most is not only his intellectual brilliance, but also what he taught us about archaeology and about life. He knew how to combine hard work with joy, as we saw, a rare balance, and one he always managed to achieve in just the right measure. Of course, the scale tipped towards academia rather than fun, yet at Keros, in his beloved Cyclades, he seemed to become, once again, the young man that landed in the island in the 60s and who had proposed to his wife Jane at Apeiranthos, a story he loved to tell, always with a wide and genuine smile. Now that he is no longer with us, there is not a single day on the excavation we would not think of him, wondering what he would say, what he would do, or imagining his familiar grimace when things are not done quite perfectly, or they're not done his way. And this shows his brilliance with all his faults. Colin Renfrew is remembered not only for his scholarship, but for the person he was. He left an indelible mark on our professional paths and our personal lives, and for this, we deeply thank him. Thank you.
Obi, thank you so much. Fabulous photographs and really brilliant. And let's introduce Professor Sitagroi back for the final of these presentations. Sitagroi.
Καλησπέρα σας. Αξιότιμη κυρία Πρέσβη, Your Excellency. Εκπρόσωποι του Υπουργείου Πολιτισμού και της Αρχαιολογικής Εταιρείας, αγαπητοί συναδέλφοι, φίλοι και μέλη της οικογένειας του Colin Renfrew. Είναι μεγάλη μου χαρά, αλλά και πολύ μεγάλη μου τιμή να βρίσκομαι εδώ απόψε για να τιμήσουμε μαζί ένα πολύ σημαντικό αρχαιολόγο, τον Colin Renfrew. I shall continue, if you don't mind, in English. In 1972, Colin Renfrew's The Emergence of Civilisation, the Cyclades and the Aegean in the 3rd millennium BC, changed the interpretive trajectory of Aegean prehistory forever and permanently upped its intellectual game. As we've heard, 1972 was but one early peak in Colin's far longer and extraordinarily fruitful Aegean Odyssey over 7 decades, beginning with his very first article in 1964, Crete and the Cyclades in the age of before Rhadamanthus. Colin always had a great talent for ringing titles, great at that, and many other things besides. Right through to the posthumous publication at the end of 2024 of the marble figurines from Keros Special Deposit North, which poignantly included items found on his first visit there 61 years earlier. You've heard before about that cycle, great cycle in Colin's life. I owe an enormous personal debt to Colin Renfrew for his encouragement right at the beginning of my own rather trepidatious career in Cycladic archaeology and for his support throughout everything that followed. I still remember very clearly my first academic supervision with him during the absence of my own supervisor on sabbatical. I mounted the 3 stairs, slightly tricky stairs, to his then office in the north building of the Department of Archaeology. I managed to do that without tripping over, which was quite an achievement. We had a very pleasant and very interesting and helpful conversation. And then he fixed me with a rather kind of harder look and suggested I go away to the library and come back in a few weeks with a piece on the Amorgos group. I didn't realize at the time this was a trick question. I went away, I studied hard, I wanted to show Colin that I was worthy of his time and respect, and I became increasingly alarmed by the fact that the more I read about the Amorgos group, the less I believed in it. So I returned rather nervously a couple of weeks later, and he looked at me again and said, well, what have you come up with? And I said, well, I'm not sure about this group. And he gave me, I think, what we've all had and every refer to, what Paddington Bear also does, the hard stare. And I quailed somewhat. And he said, yes, you're probably right. And that was great. Now, the trouble is, I'm here today not to talk about the Cyclades, sadly, much as I would love to. The theme I've been asked to address today is the broader impact of the emergence and of Colin's thinking more generally on world archaeology and how that relates back to Greece. And inevitably, being the last speaker, a little bit of this is going to overlap with some of the things you've heard before, but I hope we can put a slightly different spin on it. And I would emphasize that this is a dauntingly tall order in 15 or even 20 minutes, has been brought home to me after the very sad work of organizing the legacy of Colin's last office in Cambridge, including his prodigious authorial output. Every book you see on that screen has his name on the cover as author, co-author, or editor. And also from the concomitant work on the collected papers, many of which still survive in that office, which provide rich insights into many aspects of his formative years in particular, and a few apposite, and one or two, I hope, funny excerpts from which I'll illustrate in the course of this talk. So in order to understand the emergence and the remarkable good fortune for our field that Colin chose to devote so much of his thinking to the Aegean, we need, I think, to briefly revisit Colin as himself emergent over the preceding years, following from his undergraduate switch, that we've heard about before, from natural sciences to archaeology. In fact, and this does give me the shivers, it nearly wasn't the Aegean at all. And that's a non-trivial observation to prompt really alarming counterfactual fantasies on what on earth our field would look like if Colin had actually instead gone, as he might have done, to look at other early favorites, Etruria, the Balkans, southern Russia, notably all of these areas with extraordinary artistic traditions that I think appealed to him even in those formative days. It came down to a little bit of serendipity, his aesthetic interest in modernism, a growing love for Greece, which you can see through the papers as he travels more there, and clear-sighted planning that he did, as we've all heard, devote so much of his life to the Aegean. We know now from his own testimony that his early admiration for a Cycladic marble head in the Louvre, as already alluded to by Michael, played a part, as did explicitly the existence of a major research base at the British School at Athens. That was definitely part of his thinking, and I think that's really good to hear. But equally, Colin was swift to spot the strategic possibility for reinterpreting an archipelago that had merited an entire chapter in Gordon Child's The Dawn of European Civilization, was implicated in purported connections from Karanovo in the Balkans all the way to Copper Age Iberia, yet remains, since the work of Suntas, poorly understood in itself. And this is, I think, something we heard from Professor Dumas earlier in terms of the challenge there. It was, as Colin himself put it later, a sitting duck topic. And bottom right, I'm going to show you a few pictures of that we've recovered from the archives. A beautiful picture actually from the BSA archive of Colin at the BSA. The originals for some of those meticulous maps that appear in the Emergence, mapping out the early Cycladic sites, one of his early ventures into proportionality in figurines. Like Professor Dumas, he clearly shared an interest in the maritime transportation of cattle around the Cyclades during the 1960s. This is, I had no idea that you were going to show a rather nicer color version. And then down here, talking of such, one of the most touching things I found going through the papers, a little note, bottom right, 24th of January, 1964. Conversation with Dumas. A very pleasant evening, without the Plethintikos. And then the ultimate accolade, good excavation diary. The 10 years of Colin's Aegean scholarship from the start of his PhD in 1962 until the publication of the Emergence were profoundly formative. and far more than a long wait for the theoretical penny to drop. As we've heard already, they were busy, both in the Cyclades and in terms of new scientific analyses, and much more besides. But also growing were Colin's fast-growing nascent doubts concerning diffusion as a paradigm for explaining cultural change. And these had begun astonishingly as an undergraduate. Here on the far left, we have a hitherto unseen photograph of a very young Colin, a picture that's eliciting great excitement among colleagues in southern Spain. It's taken, as far as we can make out, in the winter of 1960, visiting with his parents the great megalithic monuments of Copper Age, 3rd millennium BC, Iberia. And there he is posing thoughtfully in one of these great megalithic tombs, and I think looking quite unconvinced that they have much to do with Mycenae. And that's impressive because this is before radiocarbon proves him right. And just on the bottom right, one of the recent emblematic indications of how extraordinary the independent trajectories at the same time as the Aegean Bronze Age are in southern Iberia, an extraordinary dagger from the site of Valencina de la Concepcion, napped in rock crystal, with a hilt of ivory inlaid with mother of pearl. Cross-specialization and wealth, for those of you who are aficionados of the Emergence. As the 1960s advanced, Colin's deepening skepticism of diffusion and its evident reliance on ill-defined parallels was increasingly fortified by his early embrace of radiocarbon calibration, as Evie has explained, to punch ever larger gaping holes in the paradigm's chronological underpinnings across the Aegean, the wider Mediterranean, and temperate Europe. This is nicely illustrated. Evie showed the example of Wessex. I show here the example of the temples on Malta, which radiocarbon started to show were in fact, as the Maltese proudly show in their own displays in the Valletta Museum today, were in fact older than both the pyramids and Stonehenge. And it's so important, we'll come back to this theme, to understand this gave voice to prehistoric cultures to develop their own trajectories independently of what might have been happening further east in this kind of case. And on the far left, another treasure from the archive still in his office at Cambridge. This is, I think, probably the earliest document we've seen. This is an undergraduate essay in which Colin postulates that, and I love this, soon all our problems of chronology will be resolved. They will be shortly in a few years. And then the red pen, and I think this may be one of the last times that anyone dared to red pen Colin. You see my point? The red pen is Glyn Daniel, his tutor, who writes in the margin rather caustically, "You are more hopeful than I." Well, we were all undergraduates once, I guess. Colin was aware of the core problem from at least the mid-1960s. In a revealing and very self-deprecating early passage in his 1965 PhD dissertation, he wrote, and I quote, "But there is no doubt that what is needed today, rather than a survey of this kind or even new excavated material, is a more rigorous and systematic conceptual approach to the subject and to the interpretation of the evidence. A more basic and thorough study of these general problems is, I believe, the most pressing need today for the archaeology of the Mediterranean and perhaps not solely that region." Still, in a sense, just about Chaldean culture history, but with a fresh kind of exaltation and a massive question mark. The rest starts to follow very quickly. The pithy quote from the mathematician Louis Mordell that forms such combative and memorable opener to chapter 2 of the Emergence. Quote from Mordell. "The trouble is that most explanations don't explain." Should write that in fire over our desks, frankly. "The trouble is most explanations don't explain" crops up as a scrawl among Colin's papers from May 1967, as does a tantalizing and, we think, undated page of notes, which you see on the left, referring to a multiplier effect and the prototype to what might be an order of chapters for the emergence of civilization. And you can imagine flicking through this in the middle of a busy term between giving lectures and meetings and seeing this. It's a moment to stifle. I mean, it's extraordinary, really extraordinary. This is the emergence coming into being. It remains to be seen precisely how such traces will finally align chronologically with Colin's well-known pivotal visit to UCLA and other US campuses at the start of 1967, where he encountered for the first time Louis Binford and other warriors of the new archaeology, Hans Suess on the cusp of radiocarbon calibration, as well as Maria Gimbutas with her ideas on old Europe and Indo-European invasion. All three, of course, crucial seeds of future developments in Colin's thought. Regardless, the final co-evolution of the Aegean scholar and the newly converted processualist, as well as the drastic path deviation proposed for the Aegean itself, was henceforth very rapid indeed. The impact and critical reception of the emergence itself, both immediate and cumulative over the past 50 plus years, are both well known. The atmosphere of febrile excitement among the young and the rearguard skepticism among senior Aegeanists at the boldly theory and model-led, comparative, scientifically informed and quantitative arguments are nicely captured in John Cherry's foreword to the 210 reissued edition. Even reading The Emergence for the first time myself, 15 years after its appearance, as a master's student working with Peter Warren, I vividly recall the thrill of encountering in figure 1.1 plans of great Mesoamerican cities, such as Tikal and Teotihuacan, early Aegean urbanism in boldly comparative perspective. This was something completely different. And I would recommend all of you, if you have time, to make the experiment of reopening The Emergence. Forget what you think it says, forget what people tell you it says, and just read a little bit of it again. It is fresh today as it ever was, and it is radical, and it is exciting, and it opens up new vistas. It's the kind of thing that should get anyone into doing archaeology. Now, of course, practically every detail of the title, what is civilization, how does it emerge, is it unambiguously a good thing anyway, all those things, right through to the evidential details, have since been, well, they've been intensely debated ever since, notably in a 30th anniversary conference in Sheffield and the resultant proceedings, as well as in Colin's own 210 revised preface and introduction. But I think, standing back, two general observations might be made. First, regardless of the details, the emergence offered a radically new and liberating theory of change, argued in depth as a bottom-up, internal, local transformation that forever broke the monopoly, if you like, of a handful of favoured parts of the world as the sole drivers of these great human processes. Through its identification of internal subsystems within a society such as subsistence, trade, craft specialization, the projective, as he then called it, or ideological subsystems, and the potential for their mutual interactions and positive feedback and multiplying effect. The identification of the possibility for that to promote growth and change. Through that, Colin pointed towards ways in which societies anywhere might transform without necessary call upon exogenous factors. In the Aegean case, of course, the broader ancient Near East. Now, in a sense, whether or not we like the particular models presented, or whether we think they match the ever-evolving Aegean data, or we like the allusions to the then fashionable fields of systems theory and cybernetics, that gift to global archaeology remains with us all. Like, say, the emergence of agriculture seen here, or writing, the propensity for social change from within and from below during prehistory was something widely distributed among humanity across the planet. That's an important and I think a good thought to hold for all of us today. Second, as a result of the emergence, the wider archaeological world looked up and they noticed the early Aegean, suddenly emerging from the shadow of classics to take up its rightful place on the stage of global prehistory. And the Aegean has vastly benefited by being promoted as Colin's poster child in a book of such immense reach and application. Over 50 years ago, he made the region cool, if I may say that, for anthropologically minded, theory-inclined archaeologists. His modernist confidence and optimism in the scope for rigorous, comparative, ambitious social interpretation within an explicitly theoretically informed, scientifically evidenced, and problem-oriented framework has proven infectious. There's no time today to attempt a formal scholarly phylogeny of Colin's influence over 4 to 5 generations of students attracted to the prospect of trying something new, exciting, and more broadly relevant through Aegean data. I, as will be evident, and one moth who was drawn to that candle, as have been many others, with foci as varied as sociopolitical change, chronometrics, ritual, household analysis, diachronic landscapes, material engagement, imagery and art, islands, funerary politics, material science, connectivity. The Emergence has been a fantastic recruiting officer and helped to create an intellectual golden age for Aegean scholarship. It's easy to forget that Colin was just 35 years old when the Emergence appeared. As it happily transpired, he had another 5 illustrious decades to enjoy, and they were increasingly illustrious. And this picture that we also found among the papers in this office, it shows exactly what you think it shows. And I'm not sure I quite know what the backstory is here. There is a paper that goes with it, but I probably should delve into this now. I was almost tempted to kind of Photoshop Colin's head into even more improbable kind of face. Lands on the moon, you know, or whatever. Anyway, whatever. We won't go there. Yes. Across those decades, his thought and his writing became ever more broad-ranging in scope. Yet a closer scrutiny reveals not only the deep consistencies of his core intellectual projects over very long periods of time, often going back to origins in the 1960s and often implicit in the Emergence, but also the number of those ideas that owe part of their genesis and their growth to his Aegean engagement. Thus, his fascination with the archaeology of religion and ultimately of mind has intimate connections to the discovery during his excavations at Phylakopi during the 1970s of the eponymous lady. And there are wonderful stories from people who were there at the time of Colin actually saying, "Look, please just go off to the taverna, leave me alone for 10 minutes. And someone peeked back in, and there he was with the lady on a box and Colin on the chair at the other end of the room, looking at each other and trying to see how you actually think your way into the ineffable, in a sense." And that's the story from John Cherry. His creation, as we've heard, of the MacDonald of a new centre to analyse and combat the global trade in antiquities, illicit antiquities, has manifest roots in his early experiences in the Cyclades and particularly devastatingly on Keros. His pioneering exploration, something we haven't covered so far, of the relations between archaeology and language, likewise reveal a debt to the old debate over the so-called coming of the Greeks. Or, as chapter 1 of his 1987 book put it, what song the sirens sang. And there below, of course, a picture of the relevant levels at Lerna and the great stories that they generated from Wace and Blagan, well, in a sense, exemplifying the argument put forward by Wace and Blagan as to what the changes at the end of the early Bronze Age connote. And above, of course, the kind of a preview of some of the kind of genetic evidence for major genetic movement in the 3rd millennium BC that was starting to appear by the last years of Colin's life. And I have to say, I'm only sad that someone who championed the new field of archaeogenetics right from the beginning and who followed the current whole genome revolution avidly and was very generous even when, as you see top right, it began to question his long-standing skepticism of prehistoric migrations. I feel deeply sorry that he didn't live to witness more than its very first and suggestive Aegean applications. I, for one, would love to debate with him what the close consanguinity of people in a late Bronze Age Attic farm tells us about the micro landholding implications and politics of polyculture, for example, as Philip Stockhammer and team have suggested a couple of years ago, or the one that's really getting me at the moment, what the recent identification of a clearly not homegrown multiplier effect generated Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, discovered in late pre-palatial Crete. What that tells us about how unplugged from broader Near Eastern Mediterranean connectivity the final pre-palatial emergent Aegean really was. That didn't get there by chance, and that was not homegrown. So, with thanks to Michael for my last image, I end with a call to arms. The interpretive golden age for the Aegean that the Emergence launched is now, I think, endangered. Aegean archaeology thrives in its native Greece and increasingly on the Western Anatolian side of the sea. But in international terms, at least in my own country and in the US, the numbers in terms of university posts, of students, of citations, and research funding have been trending remorselessly downward. The scholarly myopia that Colin fought so hard against also shows occasional signs of returning. Yet, as he so sharply realized, the early Aegean remains an exceptionally fertile theatre with which to think, whether as a place provocatively in between the Near East and Europe, classics and anthropological archaeology, dynastic and radiocarbon chronologies, prehistory and the recent evidence, or as a place, a Mediterranean microcosm on steroids, or as a player in a wider global perspective. And for those of us with the analytical, for those people with the analytical imagination to attempt something truly innovative, the wealth and the granularity of Aegean data remain virtually unmatched. Most parts of the world would die for the kind of information and the kind of detail and matrix of knowledge that we have. The Aegean, in other words, has an enormous amount still to give as an integral part of world archaeology. It's just up to us as Aegeanists, so many of us, in one way or another, Colin's epiphany, to live up to his inspirational example. Now, of one thing we can be absolutely sure, Colin would have relished and loved the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cyprian. A wonderful way to finish this kind of academic side of the presentations. We've heard about Colin as a mentor, Colin as an innovator, Colin as a ridiculous publisher. I mean, the scale of publications is scary. As a collaborator, as a fixer, as a solver of problems. But the other part of Colin's life, which we've seen throughout the slides and throughout the stories, is how he also brought his family along and how very much involved his family were, not just with the archaeology, with his life as an archaeologist, but also with all the people and that Colin had relationships with here and in Greece as well. And I'd like very much to call on Helena and Magnus to say a few words. Thank you.
Θα προσπαθήσω να πω λίγα λόγια στα ελληνικά, οπότε σας παρακαλώ να δείξετε κατανόηση. Κυρία Υπουργέ, κύριε Πρέσβη, αγαπητοί φίλοι και συναδέλφοι του Colin, νόμιμο. Εκ μέρους ολοκλήρης της οικογένειας μας, είμαστε πραγματικά τιμημένοι που διοργανώσετε αυτήν την υπέροχη εκδήλωση για να τιμήσετε τη ζωή του μπαμπά μας, Colin. Ξέρω πόσο ιδιαίτερα σημαντικό είναι αυτό για τη μητέρα μας την Jane και για τον αδελφό μας Olben, παρόλο που δεν μπορούν να είναι εδώ. Η Ελλάδα έχει ξεχωριστεί θέση στην καρδιά της, όπως και στη τύχη μας. Το 1963, ο Colin πρότεινε στην Jane να παντρευτούν στο ορεινό χωριό Απειρινθος της Νάξου και έτσι χωρίς την Ελλάδα, η Ελληνίτσα και εγώ δεν θα στεκόμασταν εδώ σήμερα. Δεν θυμάμαι στιγμή που η Ελλάδα να μην ήταν μέρος της ζωής μας. Η Ελλάδα και η αρχαιολογία μας χάρισαν ισόβιους φίλους, τον νόνο μου, Χρήστο Δούμα, την Άλεξ και την οικογένεια τους με την οποία μεγαλώσαμε και απίστευτες αναμνήσεις. Μεγάλωστε κοπές στην Αμοργό, τύπνα και χορός με την Λίλα Μαραγκού και τον Γιώργο Γαβαλά στην χώρα με την Θούλια στην αποθήκη και πιο πρόσφατα στο Κουφουνίσι με τις ανασκαφές στην Κέρο και στο δασκάλιο με την Εύη Μαργαρίτη και τον Michael Boyd και την Ιωάννα Ματούφη. Το τελευταίο μας ταξίδι στην Ελλάδα ως οικογένεια ήταν το 2019 με όλα τα εγγόνια του Colin. Για να γιορτάσουμε την αναγόρευση του ως επίτιμου θυμότη της Αντιπάρου. Αυτό το γεγονός τον γέμισε υπερηφάνεια όπως θα το έκανε και η σημερινή εκδήλωση. Η πιο ζωντανή ανάμνησή μου από εκείνο το ταξίδι ήταν μια εκδρομή στο χωριό Σόρος για να βρούμε κομμάτια φυσικής οψιδιανής. Ο Colin έδειχνε με το μπαστούνι του την κατεύθυνση και τα εγγόνια του έτρεχαν πίσω ενθουσιασμένα ρωτώντας «Αυτό είναι οψιδιανός», ζητώντας επιβεβαίωση, ακριβώς όπως κάναμε και εμείς όταν ήμασταν παιδιά. Ξέρουμε πόσο πολύ ο Colin εκτιμούσε τους φίλους και τους συναδέλφους στην αρχαιολογία και θα χαιρόταν απίστευτα που είστε όλοι εδώ σήμερα. Αν και αυτή η εκδήλωση τιμά την συμβόλη του Colin στην Ελλάδα, θέλουμε επίσης να αναγνωρίσουμε τον τεράστιο ρόλο που έπαιξε η Ελλάδα στη δική του ζωή, για τον οποίο ήταν και θα είμαστε πάντα απέραντα ευγνώμονες.
And I would like to add my thanks on this really special evening, nearly a year to the day that his dad so suddenly left us. This event is very special to us because of the important part that Greece has played in his family's lives and in how we actually saw him. So first of all, he was dad. Very different to our other friends' dads, taking us on intrepid adventures, field walking in remote places, often under the blazing sun. He was christened Dar by his 6 grandchildren, who loved being with him in Greece, as he patiently explained everything to him and took them out on the sea on a small fishing boat to sail around Saliagos. He was Keros Colin to many of the villagers who he would see rush up to him and greet him in Antiparos and Amorgos. He was prof to many of his colleagues on his digs, which he seemed to direct with military precision. And very importantly, he was Colin, husband to our mother, known in Greece as Juana, who he proposed to in a ruined windmill just outside Apeirinthos. And my mother has given me these words to read to you. I am very sorry not to be well enough to be with you today. Our children, Helena and Magnus, and 2 of our grandchildren, Archie and Jake, are here to represent the family. Colin was first attracted to Greek archaeology when, on his first visit to the Louvre in Paris, with his parents shortly after the end of the war, he saw the large early Bronze Age Cycladic white marble head. He did not have the possibility to follow up his interest in Greek archaeology until he joined Bob Rodden's excavations near Nicomedia in 1962. After the excavation, he went on a trip to the Cycladic islands, visiting Antiparos, Paros, and Naxos, and decided to make the prehistoric Aegean his major research interest. It also became the source of many lifelong friendships, in particular with Professor Christos Dumos and Alex, and the Marakis family on Antiparos and the Kondopides family on Naxos. Not only did he love the narrow streets of whitewashed houses, the churches with their blue domes, and the windmills all set beside a blue sea under a sunlit sky, but he much enjoyed joining in the local festivities, especially the singing and the dancing. Thank you all for coming to Colin's memorial meeting today. I know he would have been hugely touched to see you all here.
Our evening is almost over, but one final thing. Earlier this year, the Demos of Naxos and the small Cyclades honored Colin and myself as honorary citizens, as epitome demotes. And we have here with us this evening Andonis Kobeos, who is Antidimarchos of Naxos and the small Cyclades, and he will present to Colin's children the symbols of that honor which was given to Colin this year.
So with that, I can promise there are tissues downstairs for everybody who's now in floods of tears, but along with tissues, there's some wine and nibbles. So please join us. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you to all our speakers, our honoured guests, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening over a glass of wine. Thank you.